Chapter 345. Theoretically speaking, the light magic that the priests mastered was a type of magic. However, for the commoners living at the bottom of society, the two types of magic were completely different. Facing the mysterious magicians, they were in awe, but their fear far exceeded their respect. Facing the priests, they were also in awe, but the respect here far exceeded the fear. What was the use of magic? Some people said that it could protect themselves and their country, while others said that it could eradicate evil. But no matter how many times they said it, magic was used to kill all kinds of lives. The unique light magic could play a role in saving lives and relieving illnesses. The more powerful the nature magic was, the more superior and inviolable the masters who mastered it were, and the commoners naturally became more insignificant. The spread of light magic, on the other hand, could bring all kinds of benefits to the commoners. It was inevitable that people would fall sick when they ate grain and coarse food. With a church in the city, they would no longer have to buy expensive magic potions when they fell sick. As long as they became believers, the compassionate priests would naturally help them. Therefore, although Jedds did not publicize the groundbreaking ceremony of the church, nor did he have the intention to advertise, the news still spread very quickly in the city. Since the morning, the new church was crowded with people. By noon, the crowd could be counted in the tens of thousands. In fact, Jedds himself did not expect such a big impact. If he really wanted to hold a large-scale ceremony, he would definitely invite Guevara, Majordomo Gale, and Han Jean. However, he only mentioned it to Han Jean in a casual tone. As for Guevara and Majordomo Gale, he did not even mention it. Jedds had a very keen political sense. He knew very well that the overly fanatical remarks of some of the priests had already aroused the vigilance and disgust of the masters around Han Jean. Han Jin's attitude was also somewhat ambiguous, so he had to keep a low profile. However, since they were already here, he couldn't just chase these future believers away, so he could only continue the ceremony according to the original plan. From where Han Jean and Yelena were standing, they could no longer see Jedds's face clearly. They were too far away and could only see a few black dots on the high platform. However, Jedds's voice was exceptionally clear and resounded throughout the entire arena. Every time he spoke, a holy light curtain would descend from the sky. The light curtain covered a large area, enough to bathe everyone present in its light. Be grateful to those who hurt you, because they have tempered your will. Be grateful to the person who tripped you, because he strengthened your legs. Be grateful to the person who deceived you, because he has increased your wisdom. Be grateful to those who despise you, because they have awakened your self-esteem. Be grateful to the person who abandoned you, because he taught you to be independent. His voice was not loud at all. On the contrary, it sounded very gentle, but it was able to reach everyone's ears. Hearing these words of advice, Han Jean couldn't help but laugh. He knew very well that Jedds didn't have any feelings of gratitude toward Nicholas. "What are you laughing at?" Yelena raised her head. "Nothing, I just remembered a sentence in the doctrine." Han Jean smiled. "Tell me, what is it?" Yelena asked. "If someone slaps you on the left side of your face, you have to stretch out your right side and let him hit you. Use love to conquer your own selfishness, and use love to influence the world." "No way? Why haven't I seen it before?" Yeah, I've read the doctrine before." Yelena nodded vigorously. "If it's really that funny, I'll definitely remember it. That should be from another book of teachings. This should be lost now." Han Jean looked around. "Actually, it can't be described as funny, because there are indeed people with great personalities in the world. If someone slaps you on the left side of your face, you have to stretch out your right side and let him hit you. Is this kind of person great?" Yelena asked, puzzled. "What you don't understand can't be limited to this sentence," Han Jean said softly. "What the doctrine wants to express is an idea, a state of mind." "Oh." Yelena blinked her eyes as if she understood. Han Jin suddenly lowered his head and whispered in Yelena's ear, "But I'm not that kind of great person." Hee hee. Yelena laughed mischievously, then stood on her tiptoes and whispered softly and firmly in Han Jin's ear, "Neither am I." "Yes, I know." Han Jin's eyes were full of smiles. Yelena smiled even more happily, wrinkling her nose and hugging Han Jin even tighter. She then looked around and sighed. There are so many people. In front of Han Jin and Yelena, countless people were crowded together, brushing against each other. There were no soldiers to maintain order. Fortunately, the light magic was auspicious. If a meteorite fell from the sky at this moment, the crowd would immediately collapse, followed by a disastrous stampede. "Look, there are still people squeezing in there." Yelena pointed into the distance. Han Jin looked in the direction of Yelena's finger, nodded slightly, and then showed a thoughtful expression. When the church is built and officially starts to recruit believers, maybe the entire city will become believers. Yelena was sighing at the spectacular scene in front of her, but as soon as she said this, her expression changed. Although she was still very immature, she grew up in the Duke's mansion and knew very well what this meant to Han Jin. "What nonsense are you thinking?" Han Jin smiled and reached out his hand, scratching the tip of Yelena's nose. "This is not something you should worry about." Han Jin was a layman when it came to the so-called politic. Perhaps he was helpless, didn't know how to choose, or didn't have extra energy, but he had never interfered in government affairs. However, this kind of silence was in line with the highest law of this chaotic world. Han Jin only needed to focus on cultivation. In the face of absolute power, all the contradictions in ideas and principles would be compromised, or even surrendered. It was hard to imagine that Han Jin could single-handedly destroy the entire upper echelon of the Curia, and then the Curia would still bewitch the people to go against Han Jin. To put it bluntly, as long as one could become Buddha, no matter how naughty Sun Wukong was, he wouldn't be able to escape. Besides, Jedi's wasn't the only supra-powerhouse. There were also Guevara and Major Domo Gale. Han Jin believed that the three of them would naturally constantly seek a balance, so he didn't need to worry. "You're so annoying." Yelena touched her nose worriedly. "There are so many people here, there's nothing to see." Han Jin smiled. "Let's go somewhere else?" Yelena thought for a moment and said coquettishly, "Raphael, where did Harley and the others go just now?" "They're going to a bar." At the mention of this, Han Jin wanted to laugh. Harley was a brainless guy. Of course, in fact, he really didn't have any brains. How could he want to go to a bar to drink with girls? Things were different now. They were the rulers of the Holy Crown City. Although they were inconspicuous on the God of War in the Holy Crown City, they were all big shot. If this matter was spread out, wouldn't they be laughed at? "Which bar?" "I think it's the Turkey Bar." Han Jin looked into the distance and answered absent-mindedly. A few groups of soldiers came over from afar. Judging by their armor and flags, they were soldiers of Yalan Wright's mountain army. Their reaction speed was too slow. Knowing that there was a large gathering here, he should have sent soldiers over to maintain order. He needed to find time to talk to Yalan Wright. Since the mountain army was responsible for maintaining order in the city, as the commander of the army, he had to do his best. "Raphael, can you take me to the Turkey Bar?" "What?" Han Jin was stunned. "Please." Yelena begged. Han Jin's face fell. Going to a bar was no problem, but the Turkey Bar was definitely out of the question. According to Harley, the barmaids there were all topless. Just think about it, the atmosphere there was no worse than the underground bars. "Can't I?" Yelena saw the change in Han Jin's expression and felt a little scared. In fact, she hadn't been happy for long, so she always felt that it was unrealistic. She was afraid that when she woke up, the world would return to normal. Seeing Han Jin's expression change, she was very, very uneasy. "Let's go somewhere else. That's not a place for girls." Han Jin thought for a moment. "How about the Night of Bliss?" Also, see Hollister and Chipango. I haven't seen them in almost half a month. Okay. Yelena's shock turned into joy and she nodded vigorously. She didn't care where they went. As long as Han Jin was with her, she was willing to go even to hell. The two of them jumped down from the roof. The owner of the house, who was walking around in the yard, hurriedly greeted them with a smile. Han Jin and Yelena were a bit of a bully. Seeing that the streets ahead were too crowded, they flew into a house, threw a few gold coins to the owner, and then jumped onto the roof to watch the groundbreaking ceremony. The house occupied a large area. The front door and back door faced two streets, so why would they care about a few gold coins? However, Han Jin's clothes were too eye-catching. Even an idiot could see the value of the armor. The owner of the house had built up a large family business, so naturally, he was a very discerning person. After Han Jin and Yelena went up to the roof, he ordered all the servants to hide in their rooms. He had been waiting carefully downstairs. Why didn't you watch the ceremony? Han Jin smiled. He also felt a little embarrassed that he had disturbed the owner for so long. The people here were all his people, so it was only right for him to chat with them. In both his previous and current lives, Han Jin's heart was too complicated. Sometimes, he showed off his abilities and couldn't be offended, but other times, he became approachable. Now, everything seemed to be going well because he had usurped all the wealth that Dismark had accumulated. However, there would be a day when it would all be spent. In the future, the consumption of the army would be supported by the people in the territory. Therefore, in front of the legitimate residents, no matter their status, he wouldn't show any arrogance. At least, he wouldn't be like the officials in the other world, who thought that the work was too difficult because there were 1.3 billion people that they needed to support. But who was supporting whom? I don't believe in God, the owner said with a smile. Oh. Han Jin was slightly stunned. Then what do you believe in? I only believe in myself. Ha ha. Han Jin laughed and looked around. Businessman? I used to be, but not anymore. The owner was still smiling. Sigh, this war has also affected your lives. Han Jin sighed softly. It's not because of the war. The owner hesitated. Hearing Han Jin's tone, he felt that Han Jin's background must be very big. Then why? Han Jin said as he walked forward. He didn't want to spend too much time chatting, not to mention that Yelena had already passed through the corner gate in front of them. Seeing that Han Jin was about to leave, the owner knew that if he missed this opportunity, he could only live the rest of his life in silence. No one would help him. Although this young man with a big background might not help him, he had to at least try. Sir, I used to work for Morgan & Company, you know, Morgan & Company? Han Jin was stunned and suddenly turned around. Yes. The owner's eyes were filled with grief and indignation. We have always been doing legitimate business, but the vicious Dismark, it's not just Dismark. Han Jin calmly interrupted. Morgan & Company has been disbanded. Many people who used to work for Morgan & Company have also taken Morgan & Co.'s wealth for themselves, right? How do you know? The owner was shocked. Raphael, come quickly. Yelena waved at him from the corner gate. Han Jin glanced at the owner. Tomorrow, find me at Riptide. I have something to ask you. But, sir, my name is Raphael. If you mention my name, they won't stop you. Han Jin nodded and quickly chased after Yelena. The owner was stunned. Han Jin hadn't left his residence yet. Out of politeness, he wanted to send Han Jin to the door, but he just stood there and stared blankly at Han Jin's back. When he finally reacted and chased after them, Han Jin and Yelena had already walked out of the front door. There weren't many people outside the front gate. A few young men dressed in luxurious clothes were chatting and laughing loudly outside the front gate. There were dozens of guards patrolling nearby. They were all here to watch the groundbreaking ceremony of the church. It was just that they arrived a little late. The outside was crowded with people, and it was unrealistic to drive the crowd away. Therefore, a few friends chatted here for a while. After that, they either went somewhere to have fun or went back to their own homes. Yelena pushed the door open and walked out. The eyes of the young people lit up at the same time, but when they saw Yelena's face, they couldn't help but gasp. They hurriedly adjusted their expressions and looked away. The banners on top of the city walls changed. When a city had a new master, the new ruler would definitely hold several large-scale banquets and invite all the local people with status and status. The banquets had many meanings. Other than roping in and seeking cooperation, it was also to let everyone get to know each other first to avoid unnecessary conflict. For the people invited to the banquet was very tiring. They had to remember every unfamiliar face for their own safety and for their own future. Even if Yelena wandered on the street by herself, the chances of being harassed were very low. Hooligans and ruffians would never dare to flirt with a sorcerer in broad daylight, and they might not even dare to do so at night. Those who were confident and dared to do so all knew Yelena. Of course, Yelena wouldn't necessarily recognize them. Most of the changes in aristocratic families were because they were on the wrong side. In order to protect their families in troubled times, the aristocrats' attitude towards life was much more cautious than ordinary people. As the saying goes, a tall tree attracts the wind. If they were not careful enough, they wouldn't have met Han Jin and Yelena. They would have been wiped out many years ago. Raphael, what were you talking about with that guy just now? You talked for so long. He's from Morgan and Company, Han Jin said softly. Morgan and Company? It sounds familiar, Yelena recalled. It's Chi Li's business group. Han Jin sighed. I don't know how she is now. Chi Li. Yelena blinked. Then, I'll go with you to find her again? Han Jin's gaze fell on Yelena. His expression was a bit strange. He knew and understood that Harley was heartless, but he couldn't accept that Yelena was learning from Harley. She still wanted to go out? What? Yelena lowered her eyes timidly. Why are you looking at me like that? I just don't want you to worry. I can worry about her here, but if I really go out, how can I care about others? Han Jin smiled bitterly. I'm not as useless as you say. Yelena raised her face and said coquettishly. Her previous near-death experience did not completely destroy her self-confidence. After all, powerhouses like the Dragon Elders Maxwell and Prudence were rare, and for most powerhouses, she could play a decisive role in the battle. At this moment, waves of intense magic waves came, and a thick beam of white light shot up into the sky, then sprinkled in the city. The scattered light spots landed on the feet of the people, on the walls, on the roofs, and on the ground. Everywhere was a pure, thick, milky white light, like snowflakes falling from the sky, covering the original color of the world. What's that? Han Jin turned around and looked in the direction of the church, but he couldn't see the shape of the church. At the top of the church, there was an extremely bright ball of light. Even with his eyesight, he couldn't open his eyes. This is the power of the Holy Crystal. Holy Crystal? Yelena leaned against the door and released her X-ray eyes. The scene at the top of the church appeared in front of Han Jin. In the X-ray eyes, the ball of light was no longer so dazzling. Han Jin could clearly see a huge, clear, and transparent magic crystal. His heart suddenly beat wildly. This is the Holy Crystal? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 346. With Yelena's introduction, Han Jin understood the origin of the Holy Crystal. The Holy Crystal had existed since the first day the Church of Light was established, and it had always been placed on the top of the main hall. Therefore, the mountain where the main hall was located was called the Mountain of the Unsetting Sun. It was said that it was always a world of light. Every night, the Holy Crystal would emit a dazzling light. Even bad weather such as storms could not block the glory of the Holy Crystal. But later, the holy crystal suddenly stopped emitting light, unless a high-ranking priest released magic to activate the holy crystal. At that time, the upper echelons of the church were divided into two factions. One faction believed that the sins committed by humans had angered the God of light, and that the authority of the church must be strengthened so that more people could bathe in God's mercy and stay away from the darkness. The other faction believed that it was the holy crystal itself, and tried to study the mystery of the holy crystal. In the radical faction, except for a few ambitious people, most of them were fanatical believers who only obeyed the will of God. They even lacked the necessary rationality. If God said that humans should walk backwards, they would definitely be the first to respond. The key was that they could not communicate with God, and God's will was often conveyed by humans. The composition of the conservative faction was much more complicated. In the words of another world, there were theorists, scientists, and workers among them. They always wanted to ask why something happened, but it was very difficult to study the holy crystal. They had to get the approval of all the upper echelons because the status of the holy crystal was even higher than that of the Pope. It was unimaginable that the noble Pope would lie there naked and let them fiddle with and study him. Not to mention putting it into action, the idea itself was blasphemy. The advantage of the radical faction was that they were united. They encouraged themselves and their partners, moved themselves and moved their partners. Everyone fought against the conservatives for the will of God, but their shortcomings were also reflected. There were not many smart people in the radical faction. A priest who was good at thinking had other concerns besides the will of God, such as justice and justice. For example, if someone in a higher position conveyed the will of God, and said that someone was a bad person, the radical faction would pick up their swords and cut that person down. However, the priest who was good at thinking would ask himself, is that person really evil? Should I give him a chance to redeem himself? Must I kill him? In fact, every group, even culture and race, had their own attributes. It was precisely because he was good at thinking that he could not blindly follow, or perhaps he would dislike the radicals and move closer to the conservatives. If he was in the radicals' sphere of influence, he would not dare to say, nor could he say, then he would choose to play it safe. However, this was not yielding, nor was it agreeing. The conservatives also had their own disadvantages. They were too good at thinking and had too many things to worry about. They would argue endlessly about even the smallest things and lacked internal unity. Although their contributions to the development of the Holy See were far from what the radicals could achieve, they were still unable to overwhelm the other party. From Yelena's narration, Han Jin learned for the first time that the Holy See had contributed to the current chaos on the continent. After the division of the continent, the lords in various places had been maintaining a balance for a long time. However, the leader of the radicals in the Holy See, Tuya, was elected as the Pope. He used his position for a few years to consolidate his position, then he raised his butcher's knife and issued the Order of God's Grace. The so-called Order of God's Grace meant that as long as one became a believer, he would no longer have to pay taxes. Of course, he would donate money to the churches in various places, and the amount would be reduced by half. Originally, he would have to pay 10 silver coins, but now he only needed to pay 5 silver coins to the churches. The Order of God's Grace was not limited to races. In other words, even the orcs could become a believer and enjoy the same treatment. Tuya's measure was supported crazily by the civilians and slaves. Needless to say, if the civilians were to become a believer, then the slaves could be released from slavery and live openly and freely. Tuya's Order of God's Grace was too whimsical and crazy, and it immediately angered all the lords and nobles. Most importantly, because of the special characteristics of this continent, most of the professionals had also become members of the vested class. If the Holy See suddenly monopolized all the taxes, then what would they eat and drink in the future? Could it be that he was going to become a robber? The lords and nobles showed an unimaginable unity. Even when the empire was unified, It could not be compared to this moment. Some of them even spent all their wealth to recruit soldiers, burn churches, kill priests, and drive away believers. Then, the Allied forces all gathered in the southwest region, and the spearhead was pointed at the mountain of the unsetting sun. Tuya did not take the Allied forces seriously. Instead, he was wild with joy, because he could eliminate all the opposing forces in one battle and become the ruler of the entire continent. However, the Allied forces did not have a commander-in-chief, because none of the lords were willing to obey anyone. This was unbelievable for a war. Logically speaking, the Allied forces should not be a match for the elite Radiant Knights and Grand Cardinals. It should be noted that the Holy See was much more powerful than it was now. However, Tuya was wrong. He was facing the wrath of the entire continent. It was said that the figures of the Dragon Knight and countless sorcerers on the battlefield had already covered the sky. The Radiant Knights were bombarded by hundreds of forbidden spells before the two sides officially engaged in battle. It was also said that most of the sorcerers did not cast any spells because they were afraid. The turbulence of elements was too violent, and they even felt that the world was collapsing. After the Holy See's army was defeated, Tuya committed suicide. Since the establishment of the Church, he was the first pope to commit suicide and also the only one. Although he had extraordinary strength, which was the reason why he could become the pope, the responsibility he shouldered was too heavy. Whether he was ambitious or not, his faith in the God of Light was unquestionable. Therefore, he wanted to use his own death in exchange for forgiveness, so that the Holy See could survive. At that time, the Allied forces only needed to advance a little more than 200 miles to completely wipe out the Holy See. However, Tuya's death made many lords realize what a pope was. He was a sacred leader who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the former great emperor. He actually committed suicide under their power. What was that power? Some of the lords stealthily retreated with their armies. With all the armies of the continent gathered here, returning home first would naturally bring them great benefits. Some were even more cunning and led their armies to lie in ambush, attacking the lords whose territories were adjacent to theirs. As the armies from all over the continent were gathered in the southwest region, most of the cities were no longer equipped with defensive capabilities. Some lords suddenly had evil intentions during the retreat. They burned, killed, and looted all the way back. Some lords returned home only to find that their homes had been destroyed. They were so angry that they led their men to attack every army that they passed by. Some lords discovered that two lords were fighting during the retreat, so they secretly waited at the side. When both sides were injured, they would go out and take advantage of the situation. Some lords used safety as an excuse to look for allies. When they were sure that they were safe, they would turn around and attack their allies. In any case, all kinds of strange things happened during that period of time. Since then, the continent had become completely chaotic. The war between the Allied forces and the Holy See was named the War of Forbidden Spells because too many forbidden spells were released in that short period of time. The alliance's internal strife was known as the 100 Days of Blood War. It was even more chaotic than it was now, and the rules of society were completely broken. Every other army was its own enemy, and no one dared to trust anyone else. If two armies met unexpectedly, they would definitely fight to the death. Different from martial arts, magic, which was the main offensive force, was unpredictable. In a battle between mages of the same level, the one who struck first would gain the upper hand, and the one who struck last would suffer. If you didn't want to fight, it would be too late to change your mind after the mages on the other side released their magic. Even the lords with the strongest mental fortitude lost their composure at that time. They did not even dare to send someone to investigate. If they sent a mage, they would be easily killed and would waste precious magic power. If they sent a knight, when the knight discovered the situation, the other party would also discover him. If the other party was also a lord who wanted to protect himself, it would be fine. But if it was a lord who had attacked several of his companions and plundered a lot of wealth, wouldn't it be like exposing oneself and walking into a tiger's den? Now, in the northeast region, including Zagund, Dismark, and the others who had died, there were only a dozen lords. But this was the natural result of survival of the fittest. At that time, the Allied forces of the entire continent were composed of hundreds of local armed forces. With so many hostile armies retreating in the same direction, the result was imaginable. Almost half of the armies never returned home. Han Jin sighed in his heart. Without order, human nature would become extremely terrifying. However, Yelena then talked about the Orc Federation in a gloating tone. The decline of the Orcs was also due to the bloody 100 Days' War. At that time, the Orc Federation was the largest federation in the Empire. Nominally, it obeyed the Empire's management, but in reality, it was independent. After the Empire disintegrated, the Orc Federation's strength was much stronger than that of the other lords. But before the Orcs could have any ideas, Tuya issued the Order of God's Grace. The Order of God's Grace treated all races equally, and all believers could enjoy the same treatment. Therefore, the Orc Federation sent its own army. Tuya committed suicide, and the other lords became disloyal. The Orcs decided to continue to attack the Mountain of the Unsetting Sun to set an example for the fickle humans. Unfortunately, they did set an example, but no other lords responded. When the Holy See was at its strongest, there were more than 20 archbishops who mastered high-level light magic and hundreds of cardinals who were below the Pope. They even had an assault team made up entirely of Holy Knight. Although they were defeated by the Allied army and suffered heavy losses, and Pope Tuya committed suicide, their morale was low and they were in a state of panic, but they still retained their powerful combat power. This war was called the Battle of the Unsetting Sun. The result was that the Orc Federation's army was completely annihilated, and the Holy See was once again hit hard. It was in a worse situation, so much so that even after hundreds of years, it still hadn't recovered to this day. The birth of a strong person required soil, and the inheritance also required an atmosphere. At that time, the Holy See had a whole set of mechanisms to discover talent. Under the College of Cardinals, there was the College of Bishops, and under the College of Bishops, there was the College of Priests. The archbishops would guide the cardinals, and the cardinals would guide the bishops, and then the bishops would select the priests. All the parishes were destroyed, and the College of Priests was almost wiped out. In the 2 consecutive bloody battles, the death rate of the archbishops was less than half, but the death rate of the cardinals was more than 90%. The stronger one was, the better one could deal with the harsh environment and various crises. However, the more powerful the Orcs were, the more powerful the Orcs were. The Orcs suffered even more losses. At that time, the king of the Orcs, Kazaru, thought that the Orcs' opportunity had finally come. However, he was worried about the overall strength of the humans. After thinking for a long time, he came up with a brilliant plan that relied on intimidation to subdue the humans. That was to use all of his power in the war to destroy the Holy See, so that the humans could see clearly. When he went to conquer those lords in the future, naturally, there would be no need for war. All of the elites were sent out, but none of the Orcs were able to return home. What was even more tragic was that Kazaru even took his sons and wives with him. He didn't even have a legal heir. As a result, the Orc Federation quickly disintegrated like the Empire. Han Jin listened very carefully, especially the information about the Holy See, because this would determine his attitude towards Jeddis. Also, how to deal with the Holy Knights, the Light Knights, and the priests. Jeddis wouldn't take the initiative to tell him these things. At least, he had already made a vague decision in his heart. As for the radicals around Jeddis, they must be completely eradicated. They were the source of the disaster. Putting himself in Jeddis's shoes, he often encountered things that were beyond his control. Jeddis was probably the same. Originally, Jeddis didn't want to do this, but there were too many radicals around him. They would try to put pressure on Jedis, and Jedis might compromise. However, as for how to eradicate them, it would have to be planned slowly. This matter couldn't be rushed. Yelena's mouth was already dry from talking, but seeing that Han Jin was listening seriously, she smiled and felt sweet in her heart. She didn't stop until she reached the door of the Night of Bliss. The holy crystal was transformed from the tear of the god of light? Han Jin couldn't help but laugh. What a big tear! It's just a legend, you can't take it seriously. Yelena also laughed. Do you think, Han Jin suddenly said, if I tell Jedis that I really need the holy crystal, will he agree? As if. He will fight you to the death. Yelena said firmly. Forget it, let's take it slow. Han Jin shook his head with a smile. A few maids came out from the door with smiles on their faces. They looked a little surprised. It was normal to bring a woman to the Night of Bliss, because the Night of Bliss was a comprehensive entertainment city. There were 4 buildings, and each building had a different project. However, it was a little strange for them to be dressed in martial arts attire. Is Hallister here? Han Jin asked one of the maids. You. The maid was obviously stunned. Do you know Sir Hallister? Yes. Han Jin nodded. Please follow me. The maid smiled and led the way until Han Jin and Yelena arrived at a small hall. She bowed and said, Please wait a moment, I will go and inform Sir Hallister. Han Jin nodded and looked around. Although everything here belonged to him, and even the maids and maids were his, he had never been here before. The hall was filled with a splendid atmosphere, and there were shiny decorations everywhere. Of course, this was not his style, but Bismarck's. Fortunately, they had defeated the enemy quickly during the siege. If they had really made a big fuss, the Holy Crown City would have suffered a great loss. Yelena also looked around curiously, then turned her attention to the cup on the table. She picked it up and looked at it, then put it back disapprovingly. Although she was dressed very plainly today, she was born in a wealthy family. The capital of elements was much bigger than the Holy Crown City. The Duke's mansion was equal to half of the Holy Crown City. What kind of good things had she not seen? Han Jin found that the room was a little strange. There were 6 doors around it. When he was about to go and check it out, he suddenly heard rapid footsteps outside. Then the 6 doors were pushed open almost at the same time, and a group of semi-armed mercenaries rushed in. Han Jin could not help but frown. Then a familiar voice sounded, Sir? As soon as the voice faded, Chipango's figure appeared in the air. He turned around and yelled, get out, all of you! It's none of your business. The aggressive mercenaries lost their morale in the blink of an eye and left obediently. What are you doing? Han Jin asked. I thought. Chipango was a little embarrassed. I heard them say that someone called Hallister by his name. I thought someone was looking for trouble. You. Han Jin was a little helpless. When Bismarck was here, he had never heard of anyone looking for trouble here. Was Han Jin not as powerful as Bismarck? I think it's you who is bored here and looking for trouble. If I don't call him by his name, what should I call him? You don't know, but Hallister is a big shot now. No matter who comes to him, they have to call him Lord. Chipango was getting more and more embarrassed. I'm here. It's actually pretty good. Han Jin observed Chipango. Chipango's expression was very natural, completely different from his usual crazy self. He had probably recovered. He turned his gaze to the wall, but his focus was not there. It was as if he was looking into the distance through the wall. Chipango, do you want to do something? Me? Chipango was both surprised and happy. Sir, what can I do? Although he had good food and drinks every day, and there were thousands of beauties everywhere in the building, he was very tired of staying here. A long time ago, Chipango would have been in heaven if he could get to this point. However, he was not satisfied now. To put it nicely, he was Hallister's assistant. To put it bluntly, he was just a caretaker of a place where no one would dare to cause trouble. Life was too boring. People like Morrisons would follow Han Jin to the end. They would become famous lords no matter what. Was he going to be like this for the rest of his life? Didn't you say there was a beautiful garden behind? Let's go there and talk. Han Jin said softly. Actually, he wanted Gibran to be the caretaker, but Gibran and Julia were locked up together, so he could only settle for the next best thing. Sir, please come with me. Chipango's voice was trembling as he rushed to open the door. Chapter 347. After passing through the building through the corridor, Zhang Tai arrived at the garden in the building. The garden occupied a large square area with a diameter of about a kilometer. In the midst of the colorful garden, Zhang Tai could vaguely see a few independent villas, as well as several large tents. In the center of the garden was a clear pond, surrounded by a row of chairs and tables. Not to mention the 4 buildings around it, the size of the garden alone was amazing. The Holy Crown City was a densely populated city, and the land near the center of the city was even more expensive. It was almost dusk, and now was the time for the performance. A magician had frozen the pond water into ice, and about 20 female elves were dancing barefoot on the ice. The person in charge of playing the music was also an elven musician. Although this artificial ice was as cold as the ice outside, the elves worked very hard. Humans could not be compared to each other, and the elves were the same. What kind of life did the elves in the prison camp have? In order to ensure their safety, they had to work hard. Seeing this scene from afar, Yelena showed a slightly sympathetic look, but Han Jin and Chipango were not moved. Invaders were invaders. No matter how profound their cultural heritage was, no matter how beautiful they could not cover up their crimes. The chairs by the pond were full of people. Judging from their clothes and the number of guards, they were all either rich or noble. Chipango was very clear that Han Jin, who was with Yelena, would not watch this kind of performance, not to mention that there were some more outrageous performances to come. So he took Han Jin directly into a small villa. After the 3 of them sat down, Han Jin paused, pondered over his words and began, Adonis and the other Saint Knight. Hearing Han Jin mention the Saint Knight of the Vatican, Yelena excused herself and left the living room. She did not want to listen. First, it meant nothing to her. Second, she remembered her father's words. When she was a child, one of her father's most capable assistants had a family conflict. Because the assistant was focused on magic research, he did not leave the laboratory for half a year. Of course, he did not go home either. The assistant's wife complained to the Duke's mansion, but was scolded by her father and left resentfully. At that time, her father said not to try to tie an iron chain around the neck of a lion, and that only a dog would be willing to be tied up. Although this was a bit overbearing and unreasonable, Yelena vaguely understood that some men did not want to be tied down. Therefore, even though her relationship with Han Jin was getting closer, she did not want to give orders in front of Han Jin, especially when it came to important matters, unless Han Jin took the initiative to ask for her opinion. Han Jin and Chipango chatted for a long time. It was late at night when Chipango left the small villa, half happy and half sad. Obviously, what Han Jin had asked him to do was not easy. Han Jin closed his eyes and pondered for a moment. He got up and walked slowly into the bedroom. He found that Yelena had fallen asleep on the bed. He did not wake her up and walked back to the living room. He opened the window and enjoyed the night view of the garden. The performance of the elves was coming to an end. 7 or 8 elves who were close to half-naked were desperately twisting their bodies in a flirtatious manner. The emotions of the audience around them were also aroused. From time to time there were shouts and whistles. This was not the dance of the elves. He had seen the same seductive dance of the sirens in the underground city before. In order to survive, they had learned a lot, whether they were willing or not. In fact, wasn't Han Jin the same? When Yelena told him about the Vatican's past, he only had a vague idea in his mind. However, when he asked Chipango, his ideas became clearer and clearer, and a complete plan was formed. In the past, he was not willing to scheme against others like this, let alone against a friend. But now, he had to do it. After so many days, he had gradually come to understand Jedis. He also liked Jedis, so he couldn't just watch Jedis go down the wrong path and then draw their swords against each other. Whether this change was good or bad, Han Jin did not know, but he never regretted it. After occupying the Bite Man and the Holy Crown City, the magic crystals he seized had filled more than a dozen rooms on the God of War. Of course, they were not piled up randomly. As for using the God of War as a warehouse, it was because Guevara's policy was to attack, attack, and attack. All the magic crystal cannons in the Holy Crown City were installed on the God of War, and the Magic Legion was divided into two. Dozens of the most powerful magicians were on the God of War. If he had chosen to live in seclusion because of fear, he would still be hiding in the forest with Stilberg, looking for second-grade and third-grade holy animals. Maybe he would have been killed by a high-grade holy animal. How could that kind of life be compared to now? Just when Han Jin was lost in thought, someone knocked on the door twice. Han Jin turned around and said slowly, "Come in." The door opened and Hollister walked in with a smile. He used to be a gigolo who relied on women to make a living, but after being the manager for more than a month, he looked much more energetic than before. His eyebrows were full of confidence. Hollister bowed slightly and said, "Sir, Chipango told me that you were here, so I came to see you. I hope I didn't disturb you." "Chipango told you? I see you have been waiting outside for a long time." Han Jin smiled and pointed to a chair. "Sit down. What's the matter?" After being exposed by Han Jin, Hollister looked a bit embarrassed. "Sir, I heard from Master Guevara that you went out a few days ago and encountered some orc warriors near Nuremberg. Is that true?" "Yes." "That's great," Hollister said happily. "Sir, if you catch any orc captives in the future, can you send them to me first?" "What do you want orc captives for?" Han Jin asked, puzzled. "Sir, you made me the manager of the Night of Bliss. My job is, of course, to find a way to empty the pockets of the nobles." Hollister sighed. "But business is getting harder and harder. People are never satisfied. If you want to make more money, you have to innovate. I agree with your idea, but what does it have to do with orc captives?" "My lord, you see." Hollister chuckled as he moved closer to the window and pointed outside. "Don't you think that it's weird and exciting to see an unusually muscular orc warrior standing next to an elf? Let's talk about it when we catch orc captive." Han Jin frowned. He understood what Hollister was trying to say. "But you need to be careful. Don't do anything that will cause trouble. Last time, Alexander killed more than 600 elven prisoners of war, which caused him to be criticized by some for being too cruel. If you become the target of those people, sir, don't worry. This isn't an army." Hollister was overjoyed. "I can have someone else do it. Even if something happens, I won't have to take responsibility. You have to have a bottom line, understand?" Han Jin said slowly. "I understand, sir." Hollister smiled. "I'll take that as a yes, sir." "Yes." Han Jin nodded. Seeing that Hollister didn't intend to leave, he asked, "Do you have anything else to say?" "Well..." Hollister hesitated. "Sir, I don't know if I should say it." "Nonsense, you've already said it." Hollister clenched his teeth. "Sir, can you say hello to Sir Langning? Tell him to restrain his generals." "What's wrong?" "They eat, drink, and play here. They never pay, and I don't dare ask them for money. But, if it was just them, I could still afford it. But they always come here to treat us. Every time they come, they bring a large group of people. Plus, some nobles and merchants want to please them. Originally, someone else should be the one paying, but those generals just have to pretend to be generous. Damn it. They don't have to pay anyway." Hollister looked angry. Sir, we can't go on like this. We might even lose money. You can lose money here. Han Jin's expression was strange. Sir, there are many places that require money, Hollister complained. All the VIP rooms here are equipped with magic lamps. There are more than 300 of them in total, and the other rooms use up more than 40,000 candles every day. As for food and drinks, we can earn a bit, but that won't be counted for now. But I have to be paid, right? There are more than 30 magicians here. They have to be paid, right? There are also nearly 200 guards and more than 2,000 elves. They all have to be paid, right? Elves get paid too. Sir, I haven't had time to tell you yet. Hollister scratched his head and looked at Han Jin nervously. In order to encourage the elves to work hard, I promise that as long as they can pay a certain amount of ransom, they can regain their freedom. How much ransom? 5,000 gold coins per person. Han Jin was stunned. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Ever since he became the Lord, he had no concept of money. The last time was when he owed a debt of more than 10,000 gold coins in isolated Cliff City, but that was a collective debt. But now, he was asking for a ransom of 5,000 gold coins for each elf. This was simply too much, and it was an exorbitant price. How many years do you think they'll have to work to earn enough money? They have a long life anyway, don't they? 30 to 50 years of hard work should be enough. Hollister smiled. This can't go on. But you shouldn't have come to me. Han Jin shook his head. He couldn't understand how Hollister calculated that he would lose money. The ransom of one elf was enough to buy a candle for 1,000 years. You should have gone to Lang Ning or Guevara directly. Sir, you don't care. Hollister's face suddenly became bitter. But you should at least have an opinion, right? Otherwise, what should I say to them? Those generals of Riptide, do they have a bill? Yes, Hollister said repeatedly. I have it with me all the time. Sir, do you want to see it? No need. Just give it to Lang Ning and tell him. I said that the rules can't be broken. Riptide will pay for it. Han Jin said softly. If someone wants to be special, others will naturally follow suit. In the end, it will only become more and more chaotic. It's time to teach them a lesson. Sir, no way. Hollister's expression was a bit sluggish. His original intention was to let Han Jin warn the generals of Riptide. He only brought the bill with him to prove how difficult it was for him and how wronged he felt. He didn't expect Han Jin to collect all the debt. At this moment, a cry of surprise came from the bedroom, followed by Yelena's scream. Raphael! Han Jin's eyes narrowed, and his figure disappeared from the spot. He directly broke through the door and rushed in, just in time to see Yelena pouncing on him with her arms wide open and bumping into his chest. Don't be scared. What's wrong? Han Jin could feel that Yelena's body was trembling. He gently stroked her back and said softly, Don't worry. Hollister, who was outside, was also shocked. He almost sounded the alarm, but he relaxed when he saw that Yelena was fine. However, this was not a place where he could stay. Hollister slowly backed away and quietly opened the door. In the bedroom, Han Jin finally figured out the reason from Yelena's incoherent pleading. She had a nightmare in which her father, Grand Duke Solomon, had a relapse and died of his old illness. Han Jin could understand. Nightmares were not scary in themselves. What was scary was that she didn't believe it and thought it would never happen. However, she couldn't extricate herself from the dream. That kind of despair and struggle was the most unbearable. Han Jin sat on the bed with Yelena in his arms and comforted her in a soft voice for a long while. When he saw Yelena gradually calming down, he smiled and asked, Did you miss your father today? Yes. Yelena nodded gently. When Han Jin and Chipango were talking, she deliberately hid in the bedroom. Later, she thought a lot about her father and what he had said. In fact, when a man and a woman decided to be together, they would undergo a huge change. Some men might become stronger because they had a sense of responsibility, while some women might become more fragile because they had a reason to escape from the storm. What you think of during the day, it's easy to dream of it at night, Han Jin said softly. It's okay. It'll be fine in a while. But my father's health has always been poor. He's always been sick. I'm afraid this is Yelena said sadly. She still couldn't let it go. She wanted to say that it was a bad omen, but she didn't dare to continue. She was afraid that her words would come true. Don't think too much. Han Jin stroked Yelena's hair and changed the topic. He tried to divert Yelena's attention to something else. It just so happened that he had a big question mark in his heart. By the way, Yelena, the tattoo on your body, what does it mean? Tattoo? I don't have a tattoo. Yelena was stunned. You do. Han Jin said with certainty. He had always thought that Yelena's miraculous recovery must have something to do with the tattoo. Whether I have a tattoo or not, I don't know. Yelena said, Then tell me, where is my tattoo? It's here. Han Jin pointed at Yelena's chest. Yelena looked down at her chest and suddenly blushed. She waved her hand and punched Han Jin's shoulder. You're so annoying, no I. Han Jin smiled bitterly. You've misunderstood. There really is a tattoo there. Didn't you notice it all this time? What kind of misunderstanding could there be? Yelena didn't dare to look at Han Jin. She stretched out her small hands and pushed Han Jin's arms. With great difficulty, she struggled out of his arms and sat sideways. Yelena, you really do have a tattoo there. Han Jin repeated in a serious tone. Hearing Han Jin's serious tone, Yelena plucked up her courage and looked at Han Jin. Then, she became skeptical because Han Jin didn't seem to be joking. She then said in a coquettish tone, Turn around. Okay. Han Jin finally found a chance to prove that he didn't have any bad intentions and turned around obediently. Yelena took off her magic robe first, then grabbed the quilt and put it in front of her. She slowly lifted the collar of her inner skirt with one hand and looked inside. Then, her small face suddenly became blood red. She raised her hand and threw a pillow at the back of Han Jin's head. You're so annoying, so annoying. Han Jin didn't move and let the pillow hit the back of his head. His face was full of helplessness. Judging from Yelena's angry voice, she probably didn't see anything. But was he the only one who could see the tattoo? It was too strange. Yelena, do you trust me? Han Jin began to persuade her with emotion. I do. Yelena bit her lips. Facing this question, no matter how shy she was, she had to give a clear answer. You really do have a tattoo there? Yes, it's a big tattoo. If this was a matter of trust, then she could only follow Han Jin's nonsense. Han Jin was helpless again. After a moment, he said with some difficulty, That, can you let me take a look? Yelena was completely dumbfounded. She stared at Han Jin blankly and suddenly collapsed on the bed. She thought this was a hint, and for a moment, countless thoughts came to her mind. If she wanted to please Han Jin, then she should take the initiative to cater to him and fully expose herself. However, she was frightened and extremely nervous. Han Jin saw that Yelena's body had curled up into a ball and she was covering her chest with her arms. Was she going to let him see or not? After hesitating for a moment, Han Jin sat down on the bed again. The moment he sat down, he could clearly feel Yelena's body tremble. Mentioning the tattoo was originally to divert Yelena's attention, but now her attention was diverted, and he was in an awkward situation where he couldn't explain it clearly. Suddenly, a piece of information that he should have paid attention to but had ignored because of his absent-mindedness flashed in his mind. Han Jin said softly, Yelena, you said that your father is sick? What is it? Why didn't you find a priest? I found a lot of priests, but it was useless. Yelena said in a voice as low as a mosquito's buzz, It's asthma. Just asthma? Han Jin couldn't believe it. Yes. Just asthma? Yelena slowly turned around. Her eyes were filled with grievance. Moreover, Han Jin changed the topic so quickly that she couldn't keep up. Was asthma not enough? Did she want her father to have more diseases? I mean, you should have told me earlier. Han Jin let out a long sigh. Chapter 348. At noon, Han Jin walked into Riptide's barrack. As Han Jin's most senior subordinate, most of the soldiers knew Han Jin, including the middle and lower commanders and ordinary soldiers. The soldiers guarding the gate hurriedly moved the sentry post aside and welcomed Han Jin in. A few soldiers wanted to report to Lang Ning, but were stopped by Han Jin. Last night, Yelena had rested at the Night of Bliss. At dawn, Yelena excitedly dragged Han Jin to go shopping until noon. Coincidentally, they met Stilberg and Miriam, who were out shopping for wedding supplies. Thus, he asked Stilberg to accompany Yelena to continue shopping while he rushed to Riptide's barracks. It was not that he did not have the patience, but that he really had something to deal with. This was originally the barracks of Gerald's guards of the Holy Crown City. All the houses here were made of bricks and tiles, and there were no tents. When he walked into the headquarters, he saw Lang Ning's guards leaning against the window, listening attentively. They were so focused that they did not notice Han Jin. With Han Jin's current status, of course, there was no need for him to greet the guards. He looked at them curiously and pushed the door open. The guards on both sides were shocked. When they saw that it was Han Jin and wanted to inform Lang Ning, it was already too late. There were about 20 generals in the spacious hall, and most of them were kneeling on one knee. Lang Ning's face was gloomy. With his hands behind his back, he paced back and forth in the hall. When he looked up and saw Han Jin, Lang Ning immediately smiled bitterly. "Sir, even if those nobles were to rush me for rent, they wouldn't be as anxious as you, right? Even if you gave me more courage, I wouldn't dare to go back on my word." "What word?" Han Jin was stunned. What else could it be? The debt from the Night of Bliss. The bill is still here. Lang Ning flicked the thick stack of papers in his hand. "Haha. I almost forgot if you didn't mention it." Han Jin laughed heartily. Then he looked at the kneeling generals and said, "What's wrong with them? Is it because of debt?" "If it's just debt, then it's nothing." Lang Ning took a deep breath. He was a little hesitant, but he still decided to tell the truth. "They found out that Hallister came to me to collect his debt, and they wanted to attack Hallister from outside the camp." The faces of the generals paled. They couldn't be blamed. They could only blame the original Hallister for being too low-key. They had no idea that there was someone like Hallister by Han Jin's side. When they found out that the owner of the Night of Bliss dared to come to the army camp and demand payment from Lang Ning, they felt both ashamed and angry, and thus developed evil intentions. It wasn't until Lang Ning scolded them that Hallister's identity was revealed. Everyone felt a lingering fear. Seeing that Lang Ning didn't hide anything in front of Han Jin, they were even more afraid now. Han Jin didn't think that the generals would try to kill Hallister. A phrase appeared in his mind: "Arrogant soldiers." His expression turned slightly unsightly. "Arrogant, overbearing, and lawless. Who taught you all this? Is this your knight's code?" The more Lang Ning spoke, the angrier he became. He suddenly raised his leg and kicked the nearest general in the face. The general was sent flying into the air and slammed into the wall. With a loud crash, he fell to the ground. However, he climbed back up and returned to his original position, kneeling on one knee. He didn't release any do-chi to protect himself. Of course, he didn't dare to. At this moment, Lang Ning had complete control over the entire Riptide regiment. Previously, when he gave orders, he used a negotiating tone. Even so, there were still a few generals who were unwilling to obey his orders. Now, he could be regarded as a real commander-in-chief. "Lang Ning, forget it," Han Jin said. Since he had bumped into him, he should put in a good word for him. During those difficult days when the future was uncertain, Riptide was still able to maintain a strong fighting spirit. They fought against Woodrow and the Beatman's allied army. It could be said that they had gone through thick and thin together. "Milord, this isn't a matter of whether we should forget it or not. Otherwise, what's the point of military law?" Lang Ning's expression was still gloomy. Han Jin grabbed the stack of bills from Lang Ning's hands and flipped through a few pages. He smiled. "Added together, it's quite a sum, right?" "It's almost enough to cover 2 months of Riptide's pay," Lang Ning said through gritted teeth. "This time, I'll help you pay up the debt, but in the future? What future do they have?" Lang Ning's gaze swept across the generals coldly. Although there was a saying that the law couldn't punish the majority, it was still very easy to find a few scapegoats among them. Han Jin smiled and sat in the main seat in the middle. "All right, you all can leave first." In fact, his original intention was to stop this kind of atmosphere. After all, it wasn't a serious matter of killing people. Now, the purpose of the alert had been achieved. The generals all sighed in relief, but they didn't move. They were waiting for Lang Ning to speak. "Milord, this is too easy for them." Han Jin shook his head helplessly. He took the documents placed on the table and flipped through them out of boredom. If it was another narrow-minded person, he would definitely be dissatisfied with the generals. He might even be dissatisfied with Lang Ning. Could it be that the orders of a feudal lord couldn't be compared to the orders of a general? However, Han Jin really didn't care about these things. The purpose of cultivation wasn't to trample other lives under one's feet, but to understand the heavens and earth. His attitude towards his friends was enough to prove this. Of course, there were differences between people, but these differences were reflected in their fate, temperament, cultivation, understanding, standpoint, and so on. It had nothing to do with status. In fact, even Han Jin himself didn't realize that the rapid expansion of his power was related to his strength, but it was also inseparable from his attitude towards others. The easy elimination of Zaganide was due to a trick, but the battle with Dismark was a head-on, high-end duel. Guevara, Majordomo Gale, and especially Jedis had all played an important role in the battle. If Han Jin was an arrogant and domineering person who wanted to control all the actions of his subordinates, and even wanted to control the thoughts of others, not to mention Majordomo Gale and Jedis, even Guevara would have most likely left. These 3 powerhouses had experienced too much, and with their pride, how could they tolerate a young boy ordering them around? Perhaps Han Jin wasn't as strong as some lords, nor did he have the judgment and wisdom that some lords had, but he could make his companions feel at ease. This was an advantage that other lords couldn't achieve. He rarely forced anyone, and when he encountered danger, he always faced it alone. He never ordered his own people around. It could be said that Han Jin was a lord who was the least like a lord. There was a saying in another world, "If a man doesn't fight, no one can fight with him." However, those who don't fight with this goal still wanted to fight. Han Jin had no interest in power at all, and he never even interfered in government affairs. Almost everything was done by Guevara and the others through consultation. He built a stage where anyone, as long as they had the corresponding skills and were recognized by everyone, could sing and dance on the stage and show off all their abilities. He never interfered, so Guevara would treat this place as the final home for his soul. Jedis also thought that following Han Jin was the best choice for the Holy See, which had many things to do. This was Han Jin's unique charm, and it was also the result of his experience, culture, pursuit, and so on. If other lords wanted to imitate him, they would be making a fool of themselves. Moreover, Han Jin definitely wasn't putting on an act. Otherwise, with Guevara and the others' eyesight, they would be able to see through Han Jin's hypocrisy at the first moment. Lang Ning's eyes flashed. After a while, he waved his hand and shouted, "All of you, get out." The generals were as if they had been pardoned. They neatly made a knight's salute to Han Jin and Lang Ning, and then left in a single file. "My lord, you were looking for me, for something?" Lang Ning whispered. "They've all left." Han Jin raised his head and put down the file. Nothing much, just taking a walk. Yes, I dare not to obey your orders. Lang Ning smiled bitterly. Han Jin rarely interfered with his military affairs, so when Han Jin occasionally said something, he would always take it seriously. Otherwise, even if he was facing an extremely powerful lord, he would still argue with reason. Even if he compromised now, he was still dissatisfied with Han Jin's tolerance. If the military law wasn't strict, then what was the use? You're just too serious sometimes. Han Jin smiled. My lord, is it not good to be serious? Lang Ning asked. Han Jin was stumped by the question, then he shrugged. Okay, it's my fault. Lang Ning was a little embarrassed. Han Jin had already admitted his mistake, and if he continued to discuss this issue, he would be going overboard. He hesitated for a moment. My lord, you really didn't have anything to say to me? Yes, I'm just here to wait for someone. Waiting for someone? Who is so arrogant that you... It's the people from Morgan and Company. Morgan and Company? The business group of Qi Li's family? Yes, I feel that he seems to need help, and I also want to ask him about what happened in the past, Han Jin said. At that time, I was shopping with Yelena, so I asked him to come here today. Morgan and Company has been disbanded for almost 3 years, right? Lang Ning frowned. I don't think you can get anything out of him. Lang Ning thought that Han Jin wanted to seize the wealth left by Morgan and Company, but this was Dismark's territory. Dealing with Morgan and Company was also planned by Dismark, and all the wealth had already been plundered by Dismark. We have to find out the truth, and we have to give Qi Li an explanation. Han Jin changed the topic. Lang Ning, winter will be over in 2 months. Do you have a specific plan in mind? I heard that you and Guevara argued a lot these days. How was it? Who convinced who? It's hard to say. Mr. Guevara is not easy to convince. Lang Ning smiled. But I insist that it is not wise to fight for territory with the elves. Now, more than half of the elves on the continent have gathered together, but how many of them are there? You mean, we will compete with them in terms of population? Ronning said slowly. Elves have a poor recovery ability. 20 years after the Silver Pegasus Legion of Wild Willow City was defeated, they still haven't formed a new Silver Pegasus Legion, which is enough to prove that. Therefore, instead of expanding, we should only look for opportunities to annihilate small elves. If we can kill as many of them as possible, under the condition that the Holy Crown City is not lost, I guess it will take at most half a year to a year for the elves to be unable to bear such losses. They are likely to be divided internally. You know, elves don't like war, and now they are occupying territories everywhere, which is a good opportunity for us to annihilate them. Han Jin nodded slowly. My lord, although you are very powerful, and you have Mr. Guevara, Lord Jedis, and Majordomo Gale, the elves also have more than 20 dragons. Moreover, you killed the dragon Elder Maxwell. Dragon City will definitely send reinforcements for revenge. Lang Ning hesitated. In terms of high-end strength, we don't have any advantage. It's not that we don't have any advantage, but we have a considerable disadvantage, right? Han Jin laughed. Yes, my lord. Lang Ning said softly. Dragon City is a mysterious place. No one can say for sure how many dragons there are, but I think there should be at least hundreds of them. My lord, if several superior dragons who have mastered dragon language magic lead hundreds of dragons to attack us, do you think we can stop them? Han Jin was silent. If Dragon City decided to take revenge, he or they would never be able to defeat Dragon City. Mr. Guevara said that if it was only because of the elves, Dragon City would not send a large number of dragons. But you killed the dragon Elder Maxwell, so everything is different. I know. Han Jin sighed. So we need an ally now. Who is willing to fight against Dragon City with us? Lang Ning smiled bitterly. Grand Duke Solomon. Han Jin said lightly. I am not optimistic about the ally you have chosen. Lang Ning also sighed. The capital of elements does not have the strength to fight against Dragon City, not to mention that Grand Duke Solomon has his own enemies. In the past, he might have been happy to see you and Yelena close, but now he is likely to change his attitude. My lord, you have to be mentally prepared. That will depend on whether Grand Duke Solomon has the courage or not. Han Jin showed a free and easy smile. I still have 2 things to deal with. After I am done with my work, I will go to the capital of elements with Yelena. On the one hand, I will treat Grand Duke Solomon's illness, and on the other hand, I will see if there is any possibility of cooperation. My lord, this is not courage, but the interests that determine life and death. Yelena and I talked a lot about Grand Duke Solomon. I feel that he is not only a great magus but also an excellent scholar, Han Jin said thoughtfully. He should have a performance that will surprise you and me. 100 scholars can't compare to a sharp sword. Lang Ning said slowly, My lord, with all due respect, you should not put your hopes on someone you have never met. You are wrong. I have never expected anyone to be my savior. Han Jin laughed. I can only rely on myself to save myself. Then why do you still want to go to the capital of elements? You should at least meet him, right? Han Jin said softly. I want to propose to Yelena. Don't you think about Grand Duke Solomon's feelings at all? Is this a marriage or a feud? So fast. My lord, congratulations. It is still early. Maybe Grand Duke Solomon is a coward and will simply reject me. My lord, if you are really rejected, then what will you do? What else can I do? I will take her and run. Han Jin laughed. Lang Ning shook his head helplessly, but as a subordinate, he could not say too much. He only hoped that Han Jin could be mentally prepared. Time flew by as the 2 people talked. It was almost dusk. Han Jin stood in front of the window and stared at the fiery red sunset. He frowned and said, Why hasn't he come yet? My lord, I have already ordered that as long as someone comes to see you, they will immediately report it. Lang Ning said, Maybe that person is delayed by something. Impossible. Han Jin shook his head. At that time, he saw the reverence in the eyes of the merchant. Especially when he asked the merchant to come to the barracks to see him, the merchant revealed an ecstatic expression. It was hard to imagine that the merchant would miss the appointment. My lord, who are you waiting for? Should I send someone over? No need. Han Jin thought for a moment. Lang Ning, do you want to go out with me? Sure. Lang Ning stood up with a smile. Both of them were men, so there was no need for them to dress up. Lang Ning changed his clothes and rode out of the barracks with Han Jin. He only brought 4 guards with him. Since he was with Han Jin, he did not need to worry about his own safety. The 4 guards were only to deal with trivial matters that might happen, such as running errands or looking for people. The groundbreaking ceremony of the Holy See had ended yesterday, so there were very few people coming and going. At a glance, there were only a dozen or so people near the mansion. My lord, is it that courtyard? Lang Ning pointed forward. Yes. Han Jin nodded. Wait here for a moment, I will go and take a look. Lang Ning jumped off his horse and strode toward the courtyard. He was a little annoyed that he had made the lord of the city wait for an entire afternoon. That guy was really rude to the extreme. That was why he took the initiative to knock on the door. On one hand, he wanted to save some face for Han Jin, and on the other hand, he wanted to teach that guy a lesson. Han Jin also saw through Lang Ning's thoughts. He did not wait in the same place, but smiled and followed behind Lang Ning. Before Lang Ning could knock on the door, a voice rang out from behind Han Jin, My lord, my lord! Han Jin turned around and saw a well-dressed young man jump down from a carriage parked at the side of the street and hurriedly approach him with a flattering smile. You called for me? Han Jin asked. Yes, my lord. The young man bowed. You want to find the owner of this house, right? Unfortunately, His family is holding a funeral at the cemetery in the east of the city. Funeral? Han Jin was surprised. Yes, the owner of that house died last night. Died? Han Jin's gaze turned cold. His gaze swept across the parked carriage. After all, he used to be a private investigator, so he could always find details that others might overlook. Under the horses that pulled the carriage, there were piles of horse dung. It was obvious that this young man had been waiting here for a long time. You have been waiting for me here all this time? Ah. The young man was stunned and then answered timidly, yes. Chapter 349. Han Jin and the others rode their horses towards the public cemetery in the eastern part of the city. The young noble also dismounted a horse from his carriage and followed behind Han Jin and Lang Ning. Why did you wait for me? Han Jin asked softly. The young noble had already thought of a lot of things to say, but after meeting Han Jin's eyes, he panicked and decided to tell the truth instead of his original plan. Sir, I saw you yesterday with Miss Yelena. When I saw you walk out of Irma's house with Miss Yelena, I thought you must have a close relationship with Irma, so. The young noble stuttered. He didn't know what to say, so after a moment of hesitation, he continued, I had some unpleasant experiences with Irma in the past, and if Irma got the chance, then I would be in trouble. So, I wanted to get in touch with Irma first, even if he wanted me to apologize, as long as he doesn't hold a grudge against me. What unpleasant experiences? Han Jin asked. My father had a good relationship with Irma when he was alive, and I received a lot of help from him. Later, when Sir Dismark wanted to deal with the Morgan Merchant Guild, Irma came to me and asked me to plead with Sir Dismark. The young noble sighed. Sir, I'm just a district magistrate, and I have no right to plead with Sir Dismark. If I really went, not only would I not be of any help, but my family would also be destroyed. In the end, I refused Irma. Oh, and then? Irma was very angry at that time, and he threw a wine glass at me. The young noble touched his forehead and smiled bitterly. My head was smashed, and I still have a scar. If I frown, the scar will become very clear. You didn't take revenge on him. Revenge? The young noble's face became even more bitter. After all, he helped me a lot, and he's also my elder. So what if he hit me? Ronning turned around and glanced at the young noble with a smile. Back then, it was Dismark who wanted to deal with Morgan Commercial Corp, and Irma hit him, but he didn't hit him while he was down, which showed that he had a good character. Since he hit Irma with a wine glass, there must have been other people around at the time. Therefore, he couldn't and didn't dare to lie. When did you go to find Irma? Yesterday, not long after you and Miss Yelena left. You apologized? When did I get the chance to apologize? The young noble said helplessly. I just saw Irma and he kicked me out. What happened after that? Han Jin said lightly. That's not enough to explain why you've been waiting for me here. The young noble hesitated for a moment and finally said, After I returned home, the more I thought about it, the more scared I became. You are the master of the Holy Crown City, and Irma has gained your trust. If Irma wanted to take revenge on me, I wouldn't be able to resist. Then, I thought about it for a long time, and decided to ask a friend of mine, well, he's an 8th grade thief, to sneak into Irma's house. And then, Han Jin raised his eyebrows. Sir, I didn't mean anything else. The young noble's face turned pale, and he said nervously, I just wanted my friend to warn Irma that I don't lack the courage to die together with him. If he really wants to deal with me, I'll fight him to the death. I know. Han Jin smiled. You already knew about Irma's death, didn't you? If you really want to do something, you should try your best to erase the traces you left behind. There are 2 reasons why you're here. On one hand, you have a clear conscience, and on the other hand, you want to seize the opportunity. Am I right? The young noble was stunned. After a long while, he let out a long sigh and wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. He forced a smile and said, "Sir, you're really… All right, continue. What happened next?" Han Jin asked. Last night, Irma's mood was very unstable. One moment, he was laughing and the next, he was crying. He kept saying that he was saved and that the day he had been waiting for had finally come. My friend hid for a long time, but he never found a chance to be alone with Irma. When Irma was about to go to bed in the middle of the night, my friend was about to approach Irma when he suddenly heard Irma let out a short scream. The young noble solemnly said, "My friend was very scared." At that time, Irma had already extinguished the magic lamp, so he couldn't see what was going on in the room. However, he sensed an extremely vicious and bloody aura. "Sir, I know my friend very well. He has always been very brave, and to be able to scare him to such a degree means that Irma's murderer must be an extremely powerful being." Han Jin fell silent. Could it be that there was some kind of unspeakable secret in Morgan and company? "Sir, that's not the most important thing," the young noble said. The young noble replied, "Irma was resting in the room of one of his concubines last night. When he was killed, his screams were short and not loud, but I'm sure that the concubine heard them clearly. However, according to the obituary released by Irma's family today, Irma died of a sudden illness." "What's your name?" Han Jin suddenly asked. "Schumann. Sir, my name is Schumann." A look of surprise and joy appeared on the young noble's face. "Congratulations!" Lang Ning turned around with a smile. "You've caught your chance. Sir Lang Ning, I'll be in your care in the future." The young noble was very excited. "You know me?" Lang Ning was slightly surprised. "Of course. I saw you at the banquet. Even though you only drank a cup of wine and left in a hurry, I have always had a very good memory, so I remember you very clearly. I just remembered a saying, 'Opportunity always favors those who are prepared,'" Han Jin said in an indifferent voice. He then pointed forward and asked, "That's the tomb, right?" "Yes, sir." Schumann spurred his horse forward and rushed over. A few men dressed as guards jumped out of the bushes around the tomb and greeted Schumann. "How is it?" Schumann asked loudly. "Young master, the burial ceremony was completed a long time ago. We've already buried him," one of the men replied as he stole a glance at Han Jin and Lang Ning. "Sir, we were a step too late. What should we do?" Schumann asked. "Let's go in first." Han Jin also jumped off his horse. The cemetery was very quiet. There were about a dozen people standing in front of a new grave. They were divided into 4 groups, and all of them seemed to be immediate family members. Each group was led by a middle-aged woman, and judging from their age and posture, they were most likely the middle-aged woman's children. However, there was a young woman who was excluded from the group. She seemed to be very lonely. That woman is Irma's concubine, Nora. Irma married her 2 years ago, but she never had any children after their marriage, Schumann said in a low voice. The people who were in the middle of the funeral were stunned when they saw a group of people walking over aggressively. In fact, Han Jin and Lang Ning's expressions were very calm, and Schumann didn't show any emotion either. However, Schumann's guards all puffed out their chests and raised their heads with murderous intent. They knew their mission, and they also knew who their young master was waiting for. They couldn't accept the honor of being able to work with the high and mighty Lord. To put it bluntly, they weren't excited, but excited. Han Jin looked at the new grave that had just been filled with soil. He turned around and said indifferently, "Dig it up." Han Jin gave the order to the generals of Riptide. Although they didn't think that Lang Ning would disobey, they still had to wait for Lang Ning to give the order. After all, they were regular soldiers. However, the guards were different. As soon as Han Jin finished speaking, and before Schumann could say anything, the guards roared and rushed forward. Not only did their attitude of facing death with equanimity scare the underage children, but it also scared the gravekeeper so much that he fell to the ground. The guards then snatched the shovels from the gravekeepers and began to dig up the grave with all their might. Irma's relatives were stunned for a moment before bursting into tears and curses. Some of the boys picked up stones from the ground, while others pounced on them. "How dare you!" The leaders of the guards drew their swords and roared. The other guards who didn't have any tools also drew their weapons and stared fiercely at the crowd. In Dismark's bloody purge of the Morgan Commercial Corp., Irma barely managed to save his own life. In order to avoid arousing suspicion, he didn't even dare to hire a single guard. Among the main fighting forces in the crowd, only a group of children and 2 old servants were left. When they saw the hostile stances of the guards, they were all intimidated. Even the children's cries had silently disappeared at some point. "You bunch of scoundrels! How dare you blaspheme the dead!" The priest who had just presided over the funeral was so angry that his face twisted. He then raised the scepter in his hand. The hierarchy of the priests in the Holy See was very strict. According to the level of their magic power, they were divided into deacons, priests, bishops, cardinals, and archbishop. They were also divided into 2 categories based on the nature of their work. One was a warrior priest, and the other was a priest. Jeds belonged to the former. The main responsibility of a warrior priest was to protect the Holy See, while the main responsibility of a priest was to spread the glory of God. The difference between the two was huge. The priest was only halfway through his magic incantation when he was surrounded by the guards. Fortunately, without Han Jin's orders, they didn't dare to go too far. They only pushed the priest to the ground and started beating him up. "Stop! All of you, stop!" Schumann was furious. The guards raised their heads and saw Schumann's face turn green. They couldn't help but be stunned. "Schumann, if you really want to make a difference, you should at least have the ability to restrain your subordinates," Han Jin said indifferently. "Remember, I am not Dismark." "I understand, my lord." Schumann only felt that his chest was about to explode. After the conversation on the way here, he should be able to get some points, and the guard's performance would definitely be reduced by a lot. However, now was not the time to scold his subordinates, so he could only endure it. "Scoundrels! You bunch of scoundrels!" The priest struggled to get up from the ground and screamed with a trembling voice. He was beaten black and blue, and this humiliation was too much for him to bear. He took out a magic scroll, but his hands were trembling so much that he couldn't open it even after fumbling for a long time. If it were an enemy, he would have been killed hundreds of times. The expressions of the guards changed. They wanted to rush up and stop him, but they didn't dare to. They were afraid to let the priest release magic, and for a moment they were at a loss. Then, with a bang, they scattered. It was better for one unlucky person to die than for everyone to die together. After a long time, the priest finally opened the magic scroll and threw it out. Then, the magic scroll turned into a white light that went straight to the sky. After flying high in the sky, it exploded in the shape of an umbrella. It was now dusk, and the white light of the explosion was particularly eye-catching. Even more than 10 miles away it could be seen clearly. "Haha! You have insulted God's messenger. This is your retribution." The priest laughed bitterly. He was going to risk everything. "Dig yours. What are you in a daze for?" Han Jin said coldly. The guards seemed to wake up from a dream and continued to dig with all their might. It didn't take long before the sound of hooves came from outside, and it was getting louder and louder. Ronning grew up in a military camp, so he didn't need to look. He could tell that there were about 100 knights just by listening to the sound. When the figures of the Knights of Light broke into the tomb, the priest waved his scepter and shouted, "Warriors of God, these are the people! They have profaned the peace of the dead and insulted the dignity of the priest. Come, use your hot blood to purify the sins here." The first row of Knights of Light neatly raised their knights' spears and rushed towards Han Jin's direction in a straight line. Alma's family members panicked and fled outside to avoid being caught in the crossfire. Lang Ning couldn't help but frown. With Han Jin's strength, of course, he could protect himself, but it would be difficult for him to not hurt anyone. Besides, Lang Ning was also angry. The Holy Crown City was Han Jin's territory. Even if something happened, he should have informed the local garrison and brought the Knights of Light here. What was going on? In fact, there were always conflicts between the religious and royal authority. In order to be safe and sound, both sides had to maintain restraint, compromise, and tolerance. As long as one side acted irrationally, the conflict would immediately be triggered. A wisp of haze flashed in Han Jin's eyes. He suddenly disappeared and reappeared in the middle of the tomb. He waved his right hand and a burning sword appeared in his hand. He then stabbed the sword into the ground as if there was no one around, leaving only a small part of the sword. Then he returned to his original position. Although Han Jin didn't say a word from beginning to end, all the Knight of Light understood what he meant. The position of the sword represented the boundary, and those who crossed the boundary would have to bear the consequences. It was a pity that they didn't know Han Jin. Han Jin didn't even bother to interfere with the political affairs of the Holy Crown City, let alone the Knights of Light. Almost all the Knight of Light took this warning as a provocation, an arrogant provocation. Han Jin calmly looked at the gradually dug-up grave, but his eyes were getting colder and colder. My lord! Lang Ning couldn't help but secretly feel lucky. If he didn't accompany Han Jin today, this storm would have been inevitable. After interacting with Han Jin, Guevara, and the others, Lang Ning found that whether it was the straightforward and resolute Guevara, the calm and tranquil Jedis, or the sunny Han Jin, they all had the same characteristics, and that was pride and conceit. Of course, this wasn't a derogatory term, but an attitude that said, if you want to do something, do it. It was hard to imagine that Han Jin would shout loudly, I'm the Lord, you can do whatever you want. Someone who could shout such words was definitely not a real expert, but a watchdog. This kind of thing can only be done by me. Being a watchdog for once is nothing. Lang Ning showed a helpless smile and immediately roared, How dare you? Lord Raphael is here, what do you want? My lord! A roar suddenly came from the charging formation of the Light Knight Regiment. Stop! Now, the name Raphael didn't just mean a dragon slayer. After killing Elder Maxwell of Dragon City, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Han Jin's power was enough to shake the world. The reason why Dragon City and Dragon Region were so strong was that many of the superior dragons who mastered dragon language magic had broken through the final barrier. What did the Dragon City Elder represent? What did it mean to be able to kill such an expert? The answer was obvious. It wasn't just the Northeast region. As time passed, the glorious achievements of the name Raphael would spread through the mouths of travelers. It wouldn't be long before Nicholas, who was all-powerful in the southwest region, would also hear about it. As for whether he would treat Raphael as his strongest enemy like Han Jin, that was his own business. No one else would know. There was a commotion in the charging formation of the Light Knight Regiment. They reined in their horses before the fire dragon soared, but the charging formation stopped abruptly. They inevitably collided with each other and immediately became a mess. A knight in silver armor came out from the side. He glanced at the fire dragon sword, then jumped off his horse and strode toward Han Jin. When he came close, the knight took off his helmet. Lang Ning saw that he was Odd, one of the 3 Saint Knights. Lang Ning's heart suddenly jumped. It was unbelievable that a priest was in danger, and a Saint Knight was summoned. Could it be that the Light Knight Regiment wanted to establish their power in the Holy Crown City, so they had been waiting for this opportunity? Odd glanced at the priest, bent down, and whispered, My lord, what's going on? It's a misunderstanding. Han Jin replied indifferently. A misunderstanding? Odd raised his voice slightly. He glanced at the priest again. The priest was beaten so badly that even his front teeth were knocked out. Was it just a misunderstanding? Actually, it's not a misunderstanding. Lang Ning continued, "That guy was as blind as a bat. He dared to call you a villain. Teaching him a lesson was already a light punishment." Aud frowned and coldly turned to the priest. "My lord Aud, they are blaspheming the dead." The priest also panicked. The guards were still digging vigorously, and the coffin was faintly visible. Aud whispered, "My lord, what are they doing?" Chapter 350. Knight Aud, do you really think that His Excellency has to give you an explanation for everything he does? Lang Ning said with a smile. His smile was very standard, full of the demeanor of a knight, but his words were as sharp as steel needles. Aud suddenly froze, his face flushed red. He wanted to lose his temper, but he had no reason to do so. He could only swallow his anger, but he was unwilling to give up. It could be said that since he became a holy knight, no one had dared to mock him in front of his face like Lang Ning did. "Lord Lang Ning, you misunderstood me." After a moment, Aud finally showed a very reluctant smile. "I'm just curious." "I'm also curious," Lang Ning said with a smile. "So, let's just wait here and not disturb His Excellency. What do you say?" Aud nodded, but he also shook his head, looking very embarrassed. Lang Ning, on the other hand, turned his eyes away. He was deliberately being arrogant, and he had casually mobilized the Knight Regiment of Light. Did he think that the Holy Crown City was the Holy Church's mountain on which the sun never sets? What a joke! Aud thought that Han Jin would scold Lang Ning and give him a way out, but Han Jin turned a deaf ear to the conversation between Lang Ning and Aud, as if nothing had happened, which made Aud even more embarrassed. Perhaps in the eyes of others, Han Jin was a little immature. Seeing his subordinates quarrel, he should have stood up and mediated. Unfortunately, Han Jin's personality was just like that. When he saw someone close to him quarreling with someone completely unrelated to him, of course, he would help the former. The reason he turned a deaf ear was because Lang Ning had the upper hand. If Lang Ning had been choked by Aud, he would not have kept silent. As a matter of fact, Han Jin had rarely scolded anyone since he joined Moxink and the others, unless someone had made a big mistake in a serious matter. Soon, the coffin was dug out, and a few guards opened the lid while Shu Man jumped into the grave to carefully examine Irma's body. Irma's face hadn't changed much since he had died the previous night, and there was no strange odor to his face, but the muscles on his face were a little twisted. The family members of Irma became even more agitated upon seeing how disrespectful Han Jin and the others were to the corpses of their loved ones, but they could only stand there silently and glare at Schumann and his guards with hatred in their eyes. At this moment, a magical fluctuation appeared in the air, and Jetty's figure appeared in the air and quickly landed on the ground. Aud let out a sigh of relief when he saw Jed disappear, but he soon discovered that Jeddis, who had always been calm and tranquil, had turned pale for some reason. His lips were tightly pursed like a sharp sword, and his eyes were slightly narrowed. His usually clear pupils had now become bottomless pools. "My lord, who gave you permission to mobilize the Knights of Light?" Jeddis coldly interrupted Aud. "Sir, we saw the alarm," Aud said in a low voice. "You can mobilize the Knights of Light at will just because you saw the alarm? This is the Holy Crown City, what can happen here?" Jeddis said, "Aud, I remember that you are a very conceited person, so I don't understand. Even if something really happened, why can't a holy knight solve it? Must you mobilize the Knights of Light? Aud, is it because you saw the alarm, or do you like the feeling of leading the knights and trampling the earth?" Jeddis had made it very clear that you didn't come here because you saw the alarm, but because you came here to show off. To put it bluntly, you are showing off. Small beads of sweat appeared on Odor's forehead. He and Jeddis were old acquaintances. Ever since they were in the unsetting Sun Mountain, he had never seen Jeddis show such a stern expression. He didn't dare to refute and just slowly lowered his head. "Who sent the alarm?" Jeddis asked coldly. It's me." The priest was also scared silly. Jetty's attitude towards the whole thing was very obvious, and he would never help him. Why did you send the alarm? My lord, they are blaspheming the dead. The priest cried out and pointed at the busy shoeman with a trembling finger. What's the alarm used for? Jetty's eyes shone with a sharp cold light. Even if you bump into a wall or sprain your ankle, will you send the alarm so that the Knights of Light can come and save you? Do you think the Knights of Light belong to you alone? The priest pointed at his face and cried, My lord, look, they are treating me like an animal, pushing me to the ground and punching and kicking me. Ahem. Lang Ning coughed dryly. Lord Jedis, it's actually just a misunderstanding. That guy actually insulted my lord, so we just taught him a small lesson. Lang Ning was smart. He knew that as long as he insisted on this reason, no one would be able to find fault with him. My lord, I found it! Schumann suddenly cried out in surprise. What did you find? Here, my lord, look here. Schumann forcefully pried open Irma's left arm and pointed at Irma's armpit. Han Jin's eyesight was very good, and he could clearly see that there was a faint scar on Irma's left arm near his armpit. The other's attention was attracted by Schumann's cry. Even Irma's relatives wanted to know what these people found and gathered their courage to come over. Schumann observed the wound and said, My lord, this wound was caused by an extremely narrow, thin, and sharp dagger. What a vicious method! It was stabbed from the armpit and pierced through the heart. There might not be much blood or even no blood at all. Of course, we can't rule out the possibility that someone wiped it clean afterward. If one didn't look carefully, they wouldn't have noticed the wound at all. Irma's arms folded naturally after he died, so the wound was perfectly hidden. My lord, the culprit must be an experienced and daring professional assassin. Irma's relatives immediately went into an uproar. They never thought that their loved one would be killed by someone else. Several middle-aged women and young children couldn't help but burst into tears. Only Irma's concubine stood alone at the side with her head lowered. Due to the angle, no one could see the changes in her expression. Schumann jumped out of the grave and loudly said, My lord, I still don't understand why Irma was able to scream at that time. My friend is a rank 8 thief, so the culprit must be much stronger than him to be able to make him feel fear. Logically speaking, Irma could have been killed without even knowing what was going on. Why do you think that's the case? Lang Ning asked. It's all because the culprit wanted to cover up the fact that Irma was killed, so he chose to stab Irma under the armpit. He had to grab Irma's arm before he could do anything. That's why Irma was able to scream at that time. Schumann. Han Jin suddenly said. Yes. Schumann was stunned. I'll leave this matter to you. Is there a problem? No. No problem, my lord. Schumann showed an ecstatic expression. He had been waiting for this sentence for a whole day. Although it didn't mean anything, at least he had a chance to move up. At the same time, he also felt lucky. If he hadn't kept his honesty and told Han Jin the pretext he had prepared in advance, would he have been able to fool Han Jin? I'll be leaving the Holy Crown City for a while. When I return, you have to give me an answer. Han Jin said softly, You have 10 days. Please rest assured, my lord. I won't betray your trust. Schumann said seriously. Then he paused and glanced behind him. My lord, I told you, you have full authority. Han Jin said calmly. If you need any help in the future, just go to Lang Ning. My lord, I'll help him. Lang Ning said with a smile. Schumann abruptly turned around and pointed at Irma's concubine. Arrest her. Schumann's guards were taken aback by this, but they immediately swarmed over and grabbed Irma's concubine by her hair and twisted her arms. In the blink of an eye, Irma's concubine was tied up tightly, but the woman didn't struggle or cry. Instead, she simply shook her hair and revealed a terrified expression. As intelligent creatures, they naturally had the ability to connect the dots. When they realized that their loved ones had been killed and the guards had tied up the woman, they immediately understood what was going on. Then they madly rushed towards the woman. Even the middle-aged women were baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. Schumann's guards had learned their lesson, so they didn't dare to act recklessly. They could only protect the woman with their own bodies. Fortunately, there were enough of them, otherwise they would have been too busy. Jedis, shall we go that way? Han Jin said with a smile. Calming the grief of Irma's family members and dealing with the aftermath would naturally be done by others. He only cared about the secrets hidden behind. Okay. Jedis replied and followed Han Jin. As for Ord and the troublemaker priest, they were both speechless. Especially the priest, he no longer had any excuse to protect himself. The sky gradually darkened. Han Jin didn't speak, and Jedis didn't say anything either. They just strolled silently. After an unknown amount of time, Jedis was the first to break the silence. By the way, I have something to give you. After he finished speaking, he took out a few magic scrolls from his space ring and handed them to Han Jin. Han Jin didn't pretentiously refuse. He graciously took the scrolls and counted them. There were a total of 8 magic scrolls. He asked softly, "What are these?" "God's blessing magic scrolls. They can increase your overall combat strength. I personally made them. The effects should last for a day and a night. They don't seem to be of much use to me." Han Jin laughed. "How embarrassing." Jedis looked around and said rather helplessly, "Fortunately, it's just the 2 of us here. Otherwise, if word got out, we'd be a big joke. Also, you're already together with Yelena. If you really want to maintain the self-esteem and confidence of a husband in front of her, I suggest you take some time out to brush up on your general knowledge of magic." "So serious? What's the use of it?" Han Jin was also curious. Light magic has no advantage against natural fire, earth, and other magicians. However, when it comes to dealing with the abyssal races and all curses, no magic can compare to light magic. Jedis smiled, but when he saw the confusion in Han Jin's eyes, his smile quickly disappeared. The confidence he had just shown turned into helplessness again. "Are you really a magician?" "Haha." Han Jin laughed. In the past, whenever he was questioned and criticized like this, he would always show this kind of smile. Jedis knew that this kind of thing had to be explained clearly. He had to use God's blessing, which meant that Han Jin had met a strong opponent. If Han Jin couldn't fully understand and grasp it, even the slightest mistake would be irreversible. Jedis thought about the wording and said softly, "Let's put it this way. When you're protected by God's blessing, no curses will have any effect on you. Even if you've already been cursed, God's blessing can dispel the curse. I heard that you're going to the capital of elements with Yelena? To ensure that nothing goes wrong, I suggest that you and Yelena keep these magic scrolls separately. This way, if one of you is cursed, the other can help in time." "How do you know that Yelena and I are going to the capital of elements?" Han Jin's voice was slightly heavy. Jedis had given him all God's blessing magic scrolls. Obviously, after he killed Dragon City Elder Maxwell, Jedis learned about the battle at that time. Jedis was touched and specially made them for him. He could taste that these scrolls contained a deep friendship of mutual protection and support. Majordomo Gale told me, but he was very unfortunate. Jedis laughed and said, "He broke into Riptide's camp like a madman to look for you. You just left with Lang Ning and then came to find me. But as soon as he left, I saw the Holy Sea's alarm." "Jedis, it's been hard on you." Han Jin sighed softly. Jedis thought that Han Jin was talking about the hard work he had put in to make the magic scrolls, but he immediately realized that Han Jin was talking about something more important. Jedis was silent for a moment and also sighed. "I'm tired of it, but there's really nothing I can do." "Yes, sometimes there's nothing I can do," Han Jin said slowly. "I'm different from you." Jedis shook his head. "What's the difference?" You're drawing on a blank piece of paper. Because you're the creator, if you say there should be a tree here, someone will naturally draw a tree for you. If you say there should be a river there, someone will naturally draw a river for you. A trace of imperceptible sadness appeared in Jedi's eyes. But in front of me is a picture that has thousands of years of heavy inertia, refuses to change, and emits a rotten smell. Not only do I have to change the darkness of the night into sunlight, but I also have to protect this picture with my life to prevent it from being destroyed by others. Han Jin was silent. He knew Jedi's difficulties, but he could only create or seize the opportunity to fix some minor issues. He could not interfere with the real big issues. Otherwise, the more he helped, the more difficult it would be for Jedis. He might even be isolated and deposed by all the members of the church. It's nothing. As time goes by, your control will naturally become stronger. Han Jin could only console him feebly. And didn't you do a good job as the archbishop in the past? Good? Being killed by Nikolai was considered good? Your way of comforting people is really different. Jedis did not know whether to laugh or cry. What's more, the situation is different and our positions are different. In this generation, there are only two archbishops, Zachary and I. To be honest, for the position of the next pope, there is a fierce competition between Zachary and I, haha. I can only try my best to unite as many people as possible. There is nothing I can do to change anything. Zachary? I don't think I've heard the Holy Knight talk about him. How is he? Did he die in battle? Han Jin asked. Of course they won't say, because Zachary has already defected to Nicholas, Jedi said slowly. And Nicholas has re-established the Holy See. Fortunately, they brought the Holy Crystal out. Otherwise, I might be in an awkward situation right now. Re-establish the Holy See? Han Jin frowned. It's a ridiculous trick of checks and balances. Jedi smiled. In order to fight against the Holy See, Nicholas did everything he could to get close to the Dragon Realm. Now that the Holy See has been destroyed, what will he use to fight against the Dragon Realm? He's really tired of living. No, you've underestimated him. He's a true warrior. Fighting, no matter if it's a battle of the body or a battle of wisdom, that's his greatest joy. Han Jin was silent for a moment, then changed the topic. Jedis, do me a favor. What is it? You saw what happened just now. I have a feeling that, in the Holy Crown City, in a place we can't see, there's a hidden hand. Han Jin said slowly. After Yelena and I leave, you talk to Major Domo Gale and ask him to protect Schumann and the female prisoner. The murderer of Irma is very likely to kill again. That makes sense. Jedis pondered for a moment. Why don't you talk to Major Domo Gale face to face? You and Yelena went to the capital of elements to treat Grand Duke Solomon's illness. He will help you no matter what. That's why I can't tell him, Han Jin said with a smile. Major Domo Gale is prone to overthinking, as if I'm forcing him to repay me. Is he overthinking, or are you overthinking? Jedis couldn't help but laugh. Well, I'll talk to him. If I have time, I'll also take care of things over there. But, are you mentally prepared? Because he had a good chat with Han Jin, Jedis forgot to use honorifics, but the conversation between the two became more natural because of the lack of honorifics. What kind of mental preparation? Of course, to be rebuffed. Lang Ning also reminded me, haha. Han Jin laughed, then immediately said seriously, whether I'm rebuffed or not, I will cure Grand Duke Solomon's illness. Good, that's more like a man. Jedis laughed. If Yelena heard this, she would definitely like you more. By the way, do you want me to find a chance to tell her what you said? Chapter 351. In the boundless snowfield, a handsome unicorn galloped towards the end of the sky. As the saying goes, get used to it. After being captured by Han Jin, this unicorn had lived a fearful life. But in the Holy Crown City, its life had completely changed. One reason was that Yelena liked it, and the other was that Han Jin was too lazy to torture animals. Moreover, at Yelena's request, he had blessed the unicorn with several sacrificial materials so that it could enjoy the same treatment as the little thunderbirds. In just over 20 days, the unicorn's temperament had undergone a miraculous change. When it was in Black Raven City, it had always been submissive like a huge mouse. Now, even when it was running, it still held its head up and chest out, looking majestically around. Yelena curled up in Han Jin's arms like a little bird. Han Jin was going to the capital of elements to cure her father, and Han Jin had really accepted her. Tasting all these, she was so happy that words couldn't describe the happiness in her heart. She smiled at everything she saw. The once cold beauty had completely melted in Han Jin's arms. However, Han Jin couldn't smile. The road to the capital of elements had been blocked by the elves, so he had to force his way through. As the saying goes, once bitten, twice shy. Han Jin certainly wouldn't be so timid, but he was full of vigilance and had made all kinds of preparations before he set off. Although the dragons of Dragon City couldn't react so quickly, it was better to be safe than sorry. Since the outbreak of the war with the elves, Han Jin, who had always kept a high profile, had also become low-key. When he met the elven patrol, he would immediately turn around and run away, trying to avoid conflict. What Han Jin didn't know was that the elves were more nervous than him. Sheila and other elves who had escaped had already spread the story of the battle. Many elves knew that Han Jin had changed his clothes, and in the vast snowfield, Han Jin's red cloak was particularly conspicuous. Seeing Han Jin in the distance, the elves were all scared out of their wit. Without waiting for the commander's order, they all scrambled to escape. From the perspective of the gods, an interesting scene could be seen. When the two sides met in the distance, Han Jin turned around and ran away, but the elves' reaction was faster than Han Jin's. Han Jin ran far away and made sure that the elves didn't chase after him, nor did they sense the fluctuation of top or super-grade creatures. Only then did he feel relieved. After the elves fled into the city, they had to immediately activate the Tree of Life and wait for half a day before they dared to relax their vigilance. Han Jin also didn't know the significance of the battle between him and Maxwell. The fate of Sunir, Gao Bin, Lydia, and the entire elven race had changed just like that. They didn't have to believe Sunir's evaluation, but they had to believe the truth. The elves had paid a huge price to invite Elder Maxwell of Dragon City. Now that Maxwell had been killed, who was going to bear the responsibility? Of course, Dragon City wouldn't bear the responsibility. As long as they pushed the blame to the elves would be in trouble. The key point was that inviting Elder Maxwell of Dragon City to participate in the battle had already cost the elders of the Senate a lot. How much more would they have to pay to ask for Dragon City's forgiveness? Moreover, before Prudence attacked Han Jin, Lydia had raised a sharp objection and contacted many tribal chiefs. Of course, she had her own reasons for her objection. Lydia's reason was that Han Jin's strength was very strong, and he might even have broken through the final barrier. It was unwise to be the enemy of such a strong person. Once they failed, they would have to suffer cruel revenge. In fact, Gao Bin's judgment was correct. Only a few tribal chiefs were willing to stand on Lydia's side. Most of them thought that with the participation of the dragons, they could crush the Holy Crown City into powder. They were just pretending to be polite to Lydia. In the end, the fact proved that Lydia was right. The Holy Crown City was still standing there. It was their blind optimism and confidence that was crushed into powder. The direct result of this battle was that Prudence's prestige suffered an unprecedented blow. As a result, Gao Bin's and Lydia's influence grew rapidly. After Sheila, who was lucky enough to witness the final battle, came back, she became a firm follower of Gao Bin and Lydia. She would never forget that scene. Maxwell, the dragon elder who was close to the level of demigod, was like a poor skinned pig, rolling and whining in the air. What would the elves do if they were there? Through Sheila's words, many elves knew how embarrassed Prudence was at that time. You keep saying that killing Lord Raphael is as easy as squashing an ant, but in the end, the one who died was Maxwell. Then, you abandoned your comrades and ran away naked. How can you still have the face to continue being the commander of the Allied army? The world was like a game of chess. At this moment, Han Jin was just a chess piece on the chessboard. He had no way to know what changes were brewing inside the elves, so he could only try his best to do what he should do. At dusk, the unicorn stopped on top of a mountain that was neither too tall nor too short. It swung its long, cloud-like tail and looked around with its blue eyes. Yelena straightened up, looked ahead, and whispered, "Raphael, be careful." "What's wrong?" "In front of us is the buffer zone between Wild Willow City and the capital of Elements. It's a swamp area with a radius of almost 1,000 miles. My father doesn't want this place because it's meaningless, but Wild Willow City doesn't dare to take it." "Don't dare to take it?" "Yes, maybe they will use the Tree of Life to turn this place into a flat field. Tomorrow, my father's army will come here, and so will Forza from Fado City. Forza has always dreamed of expanding his territory." Yelena laughed. "There are some goblin immigrants living in the swamp area, but they are very few. There are also some demon beasts. Of course, for you, they are nothing." "Is there a way to go around it?" "It's a long way," Yelena said. "If we go around it from here, we have to go through Wild Willow City first and then go into the forest. If we go that way, we have to go through the forest first and then go through the territory of Fado City to reach the capital of Element." "How did you get to Isolated Cliff City?" "It's from here." Yelena pointed forward, but it was summer at that time, so we could vaguely see the road. It was more troublesome in winter. Some swamps were frozen, and some were just covered by snow. If we were not careful, we would sink in. For Han Jin and Yelena, the swamps were not a threat, but they were still troublesome. Han Jin liked cleanliness, and Yelena liked cleanliness even more. It was too inconvenient to wash in the wild. "Did you see any goblins on the way here? What do they look like?" "I didn't see any." Yelena shook her head. "We only met a bandit group." "Bandit group?" Han Jin laughed. "Back then, you swaggered out of the capital of Elements with your students. You were quite brave. Not to mention their strength, they had almost no experience as travelers. It was a great risk to walk out of the laboratory and set foot on the vast wilderness and unknown life." "I'm a magus," Yelena said with a grin. "Is there a place to rest in the swamps?" "Of course there is. Are those goblins rolling in the mud all day?" Yelena paused. "Raphael, if you really don't want to go through here, we can go around it, but it will take a few more days." "Forget it, let's go from here," Han Jin said softly. He didn't tell Yelena that Majordomo Gale had looked for him before they set off. In fact, Grand Duke Solomon's condition had been very serious since last year. Even the Grand Duke himself had joked with Majordomo Gale that it would be a victory if he could survive this winter. Therefore, Majordomo Gale was very emotional and repeatedly asked Han Jin to set off as soon as possible if he was really confident in curing Grand Duke Solomon's asthma. Seeing that Majordomo Gale didn't hide his emotions, Han Jin faintly understood why Majordomo Gale kept putting pressure on Yelena. With the death of Grand Duke Solomon, no one could protect the capital of Elements anymore, not even Yelena. The capital of Elements was created by Grand Duke Solomon, and Grand Duke Solomon was the soul of the capital of Elements. Without his soul, it was impossible for him to compete with Forza, who was at the peak of his power. Sui Xiong had to buy time so that he wouldn't regret it for the rest of his life. Moreover, his green glow had been destroyed and his combat power had been greatly reduced. It would be unwise to leave from Wild Willow City or Fado City. As the sky was getting darker, Han Jin decided to find a place to rest behind the mountain. Han Jin and Yelena were familiar with camping in the wilderness. Soon, Yelena cleaned up a clean place, released a magic shield, covered it with blankets, pillows, and laid out the food. 20 days ago, she had done the same thing, but compared to that time, her mood was absolutely different. The uneasiness had turned into a strong sweetness that couldn't be dissolved. The two ate some food and chatted for a while. A few days ago, Han Jin had been urging Yelena to hurry up, and Yelena had used up a lot of her physical strength. Today, she finally had an early rest. She couldn't resist the sleepiness and gradually fell asleep. Han Jin couldn't sleep, so he grabbed Harley and asked him to observe the surroundings. Of course, he would also be on duty at night. Now, Harley was in sharp contrast to the unicorn. How honest was the unicorn before? But now he had become bolder, while Harley, who was so arrogant that he even dared to trick everyone into drinking together, had become quiet and well-behaved. In fact, no one would be able to stand being hit by a thunder palm every time they met. It might be fine for a day or two, but after a long time, Harley's conditioned reflexes would start to develop. Not to mention, Hanjin and Yelena were together, and the two of them were so affectionate. Why would Harley come out? Was he asking for a beating? However, God knew how much Harley longed to tell. No matter what he did, whether it was repenting or begging for mercy, as long as he had the chance to speak, he would ask for nothing else. After adjusting his breath for a while, Han Jin slowly opened his eyes. With a flip of his wrist, a few light red long swords appeared in front of him. These were all inferior flying swords, and their purpose was to self-destruct like terrorists. They couldn't be used to deal with high-intensity battles. These days, he had been wanting to refine a main magic treasure, but unfortunately, he didn't have the materials he liked. After a moment of silence, Han Jin sighed helplessly. In a few more days, if he really couldn't find the corresponding materials, he could only refine the fire dragon sword. Although it was a pity, the situation didn't allow him to do so. The luckiest thing would be to find some good things from Grand Duke Solomon. With Grand Duke Solomon's status, he must have a precious collection. Since he hadn't refined the fire dragon sword for a long time, there was really hope in this regard. However, he hadn't received Grand Duke Solomon's recognition yet, and he was already thinking of getting some benefits from his father-in-law. Wasn't he a little too greedy? Han Jin smiled and shook his head. He knew that Lang Ning and Jetty's concerns were reasonable. Even if he cured Grand Duke Solomon's illness, Grand Duke Solomon might suddenly turn hostile and even attack him to curry favor with Dragon City. However, from Yelena's intermittent narration, he faintly felt that Grand Duke Solomon was a very wise person. Such a strong person shouldn't do such a shameless thing. Even if it really came to that point, he would still take Yelena with him. Anyway, before they set off, he had spent a lot of essence energy on himself and Yelena to make sufficient preparations. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that he and Yelena were now almost immortal, and escaping would be no problem. As for Yelena's attitude, he was secretly worried, but there was no point in thinking so much now. He could only take one step at a time. With the threat of the elves, Dragon City, and Nicholas, he was in a very bad situation. It was as if his eggs were in danger. After defeating an opponent, he would have to face an even stronger opponent. However, he also had his own advantages and opportunities. 7 spatial magic crystals appeared in front of Han Jin, exuding a sparkling light. There was also Jetty's holy crystal. If he could get the holy crystal, he would be able to use 2 completely subversive Taoist methods, which would greatly improve his combat effectiveness. The soldiers of the Holy Crown City praised him to the sky and praised him behind his back, saying that he was already a demigod. However, they all knew that it was impossible for him to release an attack of equal power. Only by fully utilizing the 2 Taoist arts, he would be able to fight against any strong man, including Nicolai, in 1 year. Master. Harley came back and whispered in Han Jin's ear in a very low voice. Did you find anything? Han Jin asked softly. No. Harley looked at the spatial magic crystals on the carpet and hesitated for a moment. Finally, he couldn't help but ask, "Master, when will you release the miracle?" "Not for the time being." Han Jin shook his head. "I will consume all my power. During this time, I can't do anything and will become a useless person. Wait, when we return to the Holy Crown City, we will see the situation." Oh. Harley was a little disappointed. "Harley, when the time comes, I will need your help." "What do you need me to do?" "Vitality." "Vitality? You are also a kind of life, so I will strip away more than half of your spiritual power, which can't be recovered." Han Jin smiled. "Are you willing to do that?" "I am willing." Harley gritted his teeth. "As long as I can see the miracle, even if you strip away all my spiritual power, I am willing." "Okay, it's a deal." Harley was just about to express his loyalty and sacrifice with an impassioned oath, but suddenly he felt that Han Jin's words were a little strange. Deal? What kind of deal was it? Harley's life form was a little special. If an ordinary strong person was stripped of all his spiritual power, he would only become a useless person, but he would disappear completely. Of course, the ghost spirit in the soul-devouring bead would still exist, but it would no longer be Harley. "That, Master," Harley said timidly. "Yes. That. You will miss me, right?" "Of course, what's there to miss?" Harley only felt that the sky was dark, and a feeling of despair emerged in his heart. If he could cry, he would have shed tears, but Han Jin smiled. "Are you scared? Your vitality is just a mass of evil spirit. Even if you let me use it, I won't use it." Harley was stunned for a moment and almost cheered, but when he realized that Yelena was sleeping, he managed to control himself. Because he was no longer nervous, he no longer stuttered and became fluent. "Master, whose vitality do you want?" Han Jin turned his eyes to Yelena and said slowly, "There are some things that she should know." Harley could hardly believe his ears. "You can't be so cruel, right?" With his absolutely undeveloped brain, he thought that Han Jin wanted to strip all of Yelena's spiritual power. "What nonsense are you thinking?" Han Jin glared at Harley, and immediately became hesitant, but there's still a little bit left, the yin and yang. "Master, what are you talking about?" "You won't understand even if I tell you. From nothing comes something, one becomes the yin and yang, and the yin and yang give birth to the 4 divisions. Do you understand?" Harley shook his head blankly. "I'll teach you slowly in the future." Han Jin smiled, but his smile soon became stiff. Harley also sensed something and raised his head to look at the sky. Although the night was very dark, he could still clearly see a group of dark cloud-like things pressing down from the horizon. Furthermore, they could vaguely hear a familiar cry. On the God of War they had often heard similar sounds. Thunderbird. And it was a large group of thunderbirds. Just by looking at the overwhelming momentum, there were probably tens of thousands of them. Han Jin suddenly reached out and touched Harley's chest. He whispered a few words and then shouted, "Open!" Harley's body silently exploded and turned into wisps of smoke. Then, the smoke covered the magic shield and turned into bushes, rocks and gravel, completely covering their traces. Mountain Sealing Spell. That day in Nicholas's territory, he had used the mountain sealing spell to hide and had enough time to absorb the energy of the dragon's blood. Unlike the low-level 9 Palace Illusion spell, even if someone approached, they would only walk over their heads and would never discover what was hidden below. Chapter 352. Yelena was woken up by Han Jin. Through her clairvoyant's eye, she could clearly see an endless army coming out of the swamp area and then rushing through the valley like a tide. Flying in the air was indeed a large group of thunderbirds. They hovered at a low altitude, their keen eyes covering the entire land. Even if a mouse ran through the dry grass, it would immediately attract the attention of the thunderbirds. After tens of thousands of orc warriors rushed into the valley on their wind wolves, they immediately spread out in all directions, searching for any suspicious traces. They even found the hoofprints left by unicorns on the snowfield, but when they followed the tracks, they found that the hoofprints extended to a mound and disappeared inexplicably. They wanted to look elsewhere, but their companions who came from behind had already trampled the snow into a mess. Since the hoofprints were not left by a large group of people, they gave up and turned around to continue their search. After the orc warriors passed by, a large number of orcs who were hurrying on foot stepped into the valley. Behind them were groups of shamans who were controlling the thunderbirds circling in the sky. Han Jin and Yelena hid in the mountain ceiling formation and quietly observed. Yelena looked a little nervous, but Han Jin's expression was always calm. Even if they were discovered, it was not a big deal. As long as he took Yelena underground, no one could do anything to them. However, Yelena's unicorn had to be sacrificed. Seeing the orc army, Han Jin and Yelena's first impression was the same. Poor. They were too poor. Only a few orc warriors riding wind wolves had scimitars, but most of them had a variety of weapons. Some had knight's spears, some had long swords, some had chain hammers, and some only had a shield. Did they have to rely on their shield to hit people on the battlefield? The orcs on foot were even worse. On the white snowfield, their clothes were not even enough to cover their bodies. The weapons they carried on their shoulders were also very funny. Most of them were wooden sticks of different lengths, and some were even holding the bones of unknown demon beasts. Were they a group of savages or an army of a civilized society? Han Jin wanted to laugh, but at the same time, he was also impressed. From Yelena and Majordomo Gale, he knew that the magicians under the direct command of Grand Duke Solomon had formed one of the best magic legions on the mainland. It was an elite army that was armed to the teeth. Lord Forza of Fado City was able to compete with Grand Duke Solomon with only these poor orcs. It was not easy at all. It seemed fast, but in fact time passed very slowly. When the shamans and orcs walked through the valley, it was already after midnight. What appeared next was a group of giant men, about 4 or 5 meters tall. They were dressed neatly, and some were even wearing armor. Compared to the orc warriors in front of them, they were really commendable. But what was strange was that most of the giants were carrying a boulder of different shapes on their shoulders. It was the first time that Han Jin had seen someone marching with a boulder on their shoulders. He was surprised and suddenly remembered the giant he had seen before. The two of them were similar, both of them looked silly. After a while, a few giant orangutan-like demon beasts walked into their field of vision. They walked with their shoulders shrunk and legs curled up, but they were still about 20 to 30 meters tall. If any two of them squatted down, their mountain-like bodies could completely block the entrance of the valley. When they walked, the ground trembled slightly. Fortunately, the frequency of their steps was very disorderly. If they could move in unison, it might cause a violent resonance effect. Their bloody mouths were like deep bottomless pits, and each of their jagged fangs was taller than those of the orcs. Not to mention ordinary humans, even giant dragons would not be able to withstand this bite. Han Jin's expression changed slightly, and he reached out to grab Yelena. His mountain ceiling formation might not be able to withstand the trampling of these giant beasts. With one stomp, his mountain ceiling formation and Yelena's magic shield might collapse. Fortunately, the giant orangutans did not approach them. In 2 or 3 steps, they reached the top of the mountain and jumped directly into the valley. Snow and sand splashed in all directions, hitting a dozen orcs nearby and knocking them to the ground. Some of them were even beaten until their heads were bleeding. It was obvious that the giant orangutans did not treat the orcs as their companions. At least, their status was definitely not equal. One of the giant orangutans deliberately stepped on the ground with its feet and let out a muffled laughter. After the giant orangutans, the orc army was cut off. After a long while, thousands of orc warriors riding gale wolves rushed over with a giant carriage. It was not a carriage, but a small palace pulled by 70 to 80 elephant-like magical beasts. Its length could not be determined, but its width was definitely more than 20 meters. Of course, this kind of giant carriage could not cross the valley, so the orc warriors followed the carriage and went around the entrance of the valley. Yelena could not see what was in the small palace, but she found that there seemed to be someone above the palace, so she changed the angle of her X-ray eyes. Then, a sleeping orc jumped into everyone's sight. The orc was leaning on a recliner and seemed to be sleeping soundly. The most eye-catching part of his face was the fangs protruding from his mouth. The fangs were very long and curved inwards. The sharp fangs could almost pierce his own cheeks. If he could live for another 10 years, perhaps those sharp fangs would be able to pierce a bloody hole in his face without waiting for others to do anything. The moment the X-ray eyes moved to the orc, Han Jin was suddenly alarmed. He hurriedly grabbed Yelena's hand and pulled her aside. The image in the X-ray eyes disappeared immediately. At the same time, the orc opened his sleepy eyes and looked around for a moment. After finding nothing, he closed his eyes and continued to sleep. How is it possible? Even Forza sent the behemoth. What is he going to do? Yelena was surprised and doubtful. What else can he do? Han Jin whispered, Yelena, do you remember the orc warriors we met before? Yes. The orcs should have allied with the elves. Han Jin said slowly, this army is going to attack the Holy Crown City. Then should we go back? Yelena's heart was suddenly suspended. Her father's illness could not be ignored, and the Holy Crown City could not be ignored. What should she do? No. Han Jin shook his head, but we have to speed up. Aren't you afraid that the Holy Crown City will be conquered by the orcs and elves? Yelena only felt an indescribable feeling in her chest. Han Jin wanted to cure her father regardless of the danger in the Holy Crown City, which made her happy, but she was afraid that she could not accept Han Jin's kindness. I have talked with Guevara about the orc warriors. He should be prepared. Now, the god of war has been modified, and Stilberg can barely control it. The Holy Crown City is not so easy to attack. What's more, we have the Master Tower. Don't forget, the Holy Crystal is also in the Holy Crown City. The orcs and elves will not be able to take advantage of it. Han Jin smiled, and danger often coexists with opportunity. Yelena, tell me, where is our opportunity? Opportunity? Yelena frowned and thought. Forza dared to send troops to help the elves because he knew that your father had severe asthma and couldn't start a war in this season. Now that we are in the capital of elements and have cured your father. Han Jin reminded her with a smile. For him, this was a classic case of besieging way to rescue Zhao. Yes. Yelena's eyes suddenly lit up. Then my father will lead the army to attack them. They will definitely be defeated. Forza will have to withdraw his army and save the Fado city. And then? And then? Yelena was stunned. And then, what my father is most afraid of are the behemoths. Forza's remaining troops are definitely not my father's match. Maybe my father will set a trap on the way back to help the elves, wipe them out, and then capture the Fado city. Your father defeated Forza and sent another army to attack the elves' rear. Then what? Han Jin asked. The elves will not be able to defeat us. Yelena smiled. Han Jin's side had the advantage of having many strong men, while her father had a powerful army. Both sides could make up for each other's shortcomings. Of course, it's just a thought. Things may not go as we wish, but we must work hard. Yes, we will. Yelena said softly, Raphael? Yes? You are so smart. Yelena slowly leaned into Han Jin's arms. I'm considered smart? Han Jin was a little helpless. Perhaps his biggest advantage was that he could clearly understand himself. In terms of IQ, he was not much worse than others, but in terms of experience and so on, he was still a distance away from Guevara and the others. Therefore, he had been spending most of his energy on cultivation. He could not put the cart before the horse. Yes. Yelena nodded vigorously. Well, let's rest for a while. I don't think anything will happen. Han Jin smiled. After dawn, we will have to start rushing. Han Jin did not expect that the orc army would still continue to rush out of the swamp area until dawn. However, they were replaced by a large number of troops pushing carts. This made him very surprised. How many orcs did force ascend? When the sun was high in the sky, the orcs finally disappeared, leaving behind a desolate scene on the originally white snowfield. Han Jin patiently waited until noon. After confirming that the orc army had completely left, he called back Harley, mounted the unicorn, and rushed into the swamp area. Although the orc army had delayed him for a while, it had also saved him a lot of trouble. The path in the swamp had become clear, and he just needed to follow the footprints left by the orcs. Han Jin did not stop running until dark. It was impossible to say that he was not worried about the Holy Crown City at all. He had to try his best to rush back as soon as possible. Although Yelena was born in a noble family and had not suffered much, she knew when to persevere. When the unicorn galloped in the dark night, she was so sleepy that she could not even open her eyes because she had not slept well the previous night. However, she did not complain about the hardship or tiredness. She simply kept silent and endured silently. When dawn came, Yelena could not stand it anymore. Following the rhythm of the unicorn's running, she swayed in Han Jin's arms. If Han Jin loosened his hands, Yelena might fall down immediately. A unicorn's running speed was much faster than a horse's. After a rough estimation, Han Jin felt that he had run for about 300 to 400 miles and had entered the center of the swamp area. However, he didn't see any of the goblins that Yelena had mentioned, nor did he see any of the bandits. They must have been scared off by the orc army and hid far away. Although the unicorn had been transformed by the spiritual beast sacrifice material, it had also lost a lot of physical strength during the long-distance running. Its speed was getting slower and slower. Looking at Yelena's sleeping posture, Han Jin knew that he should find a place to rest. In the dim night, he saw a relatively high hill on the left in front of him and turned toward it. "Yelena?" Han Jin called in a low voice. Yelena was still in his arms with her eyes closed. She did not respond at all. She was really thirsty to the extreme, otherwise, she would not have fallen into such a deep sleep on the unicorn galloping at full speed. Han Jin could only carry Yelena in his arms, jump off the unicorn, and stride toward the hill. Harley also showed his original form and floated up the hill before him. The flat hill was a mess, and there were countless pits of various sizes. It was obvious that a team of orcs had once rested here. Harley floated inside. When he passed by a deep pit, his body suddenly froze. His mouth made of smoke opened wide, and the red light in his eyes flickered quickly. Han Jin smelled a rotten stench. The deeper he went, the stronger the stench. He had to admit that he seemed to have chosen the wrong place. After hesitating for a moment, he turned around and walked back. "Harley!" Harley still stood there motionless, as if he was dumbfounded. "Harley!" Han Jin raised his voice. "Ah, Master!" Harley hurriedly turned around and floated toward Han Jin. "What did you see?" Han Jin sensed the fear in Harley's heart. "Master, they..." Harley carefully observed Yelena. Seeing that she was still sleeping soundly, he lowered his voice and said, "Do you know what their food is? They eat people." "Eat people?" Han Jin took a deep breath and hurriedly controlled himself. The foul stench in the air was too strong. He retreated a dozen steps and stopped at the edge of the hill. He gently kicked the unicorn with his foot, and the unicorn obediently knelt on the ground. Han Jin put Yelena down beside the unicorn and said to Harley, "You stay here." After that, he held his breath and strode inside. The large and small pits were filled with bones. There were animal bones and human bones. What made one's scalp tingle was that there were almost no complete bones. Every bone had been smashed open by something. Han Jin bent down and picked up a bone fragment to observe. The bone marrow inside was empty. The various skulls had all been cruelly smashed open, and there was nothing inside. He didn't see whether the orcs ate living creatures or corpses, so he couldn't judge. However, he was very sure that there were humans inside. Han Jin jumped out of the pit and continued to walk forward. He saw the same scene everywhere, and his brows furrowed more and more. When he first saw the orcs, he only thought that they were ugly, but that was nothing. The orcs were also intelligent creatures. It was just that they were hostile. However, he couldn't accept the scene he saw now. With the cruelty and ferocity of the abyssal race, they would never treat humans as food. Absolutely unforgivable. Han Jin felt a sense of disgust from the bottom of his heart. In fact, the vast majority of intelligent life forms had a social nature. As the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together, and things of a feather flock together. Just like in another world where heroes stood in great numbers, people were always willing to work for their own country, or at least help them more or less. A person who was born to hate his own country did not exist, unless he experienced something while growing up. However, Han Jin had suddenly come to another world. Everything had become meaningless. There were only differences between races. If he saw a human and a creature of another race fighting to the death, Han Jin would have to help one of them. Without knowing the reason, who would he help? It would definitely be the former. This was the embodiment of social nature. Therefore, at this moment, Han Jin was very angry. After half a circle, Han Jin controlled his emotions and turned to walk out. At this moment, a blade of grass growing in a rock attracted his attention. He suddenly remembered what Sunir had said to him before. Han Jin strode over and carefully observed the blade of grass. That's right, the blade of grass grew from a rock. There were no cracks in the rock. Han Jin recalled Sunir's words and then looked in the direction the blade of grass pointed. The blade of grass had a total of 3 blades of grass, so it should be about 30 meters tall. After estimating the distance, Han Jin stopped. However, there was nothing here. He looked around and squatted down to carefully observe the ground. Other than some scattered bone fragments, there was nothing else to pay attention to. Could it have been destroyed? Han Jin stood up, pondered for a moment, and walked in the direction of Yelena. Suddenly, a broken piece of leather armor jumped into his eyes. Han Jin strode to the broken piece and picked it up. There was nothing on the front of the broken piece, but there were a few lines of small black words on the back. The front of the words could not be seen clearly, only the last few sentences could be seen. We are the messengers of peace, but they want to eat us. Elegant goddess of nature, do you know? Do you see this? Elegant goddess of nature? Those who believed in the goddess of nature were, of course, the elves. He should have been happy that the elves were eaten by the orcs, but he felt sad. Did the elves really understand what kind of creatures they were working with? Raphael. Yelena's voice came. Perhaps it was because the stench was unbearable, or because she had left Han Jin's warm embrace, but she woke up from her sleep and stood up to approach Han Jin. Just as Yelena's gaze was about to move into the pit, she suddenly saw a blur. Han Jin was in front of her and pressed her head against his chest. Don't look. Raphael. What's wrong? Yelena was shocked. Chapter 353. Sunir had been hiding nearby, observing the protracted battle between the tigers and the thick black fog. She remembered very clearly that a full 20 days had passed. The 7-colored datura flowers that grew in the valley suffered an unprecedented disaster. Countless figures hovered above the valley, spreading their wings to cover the sky. When they flapped their wings, they brought up a gust of wind that blew the sand and stones on the ground. Some of the datura flowers with weak roots were even directly uprooted from the ground. The tigers were very smart and no longer rushed directly into the black fog. Instead, they repeatedly shuttled around the black fog, using the wind pressure to disperse the thick fog. The black fog seemed to have a life of its own. As soon as it was dispersed here, it immediately gathered again. However, every time it gathered again, the density of the fog became thinner. Gradually, under the tireless efforts of the tigers, the fog became thinner, and the bottomless hole could be vaguely seen. A huge white tiger roared angrily, emitting an invisible sound wave. Then, all the white tigers seemed to have received an order and opened their bloody mouths in unison. Countless sound waves blasted into the hole almost at the same time, and the next moment, a deafening explosion sounded. The air waves formed by dust soared into the sky. A few tigers that couldn't dodge in time were hit by the air wave. It was as if they were suddenly hit by a sledgehammer, and they were sent flying. After the smoke and dust dissipated, the original big hole had disappeared and was replaced by a huge pit. However, at the bottom of the pit, there was a dark hole like an eye coldly staring at the tigers. This time, no one needed to command. All the tigers were angry. At the same time, they opened their bloody mouths in the direction of the hole. Wherever the sound wave passed, the air seemed to boil and become distorted. The huge shock wave made the ground tremble. After 2 attacks, there was no longer a complete datura flower in the valley. Countless broken branches and leaves rushed into the sky along with the dust. From afar, it looked like a huge mushroom cloud. Sunir looked at the smoke and dust in front of her and couldn't help but stop and suck in a breath of cold air. What kind of joke was this? Was this a forbidden spell? For the first time, Sunir felt a sense of helplessness in her heart. She slowly turned around and looked at the endless forest. Was she going to go back just like that? Am I really that useless? Sunir asked herself silently. She seemed to see a mocking smile on her face. Look, you're just SOSO. However, with that level of attack, even if he went, he would only be sending himself to his death. Just as Sunir was hesitating, the tigers were circling around and looking at their masterpiece with satisfaction. The pit below had expanded a lot, and more importantly, the dark hole had disappeared. The tigers were overjoyed. They roared as they shuttled back and forth in the valley. From time to time, they would emit sound waves, which made the already uneven ground even more uneven. A few mandala flowers that were originally incomplete became fragmented and fragmented. At this time, at the bottom of the pit, where the hole was originally located, the ground suddenly wriggled, as if something was arching out. A tiger with sharp eyes immediately flew over to see what was going on. However, just as it flew over, a few tentacle-like things suddenly broke out of the ground. They easily pierced into the tiger's abdomen like sharp blades and came out from the back, bringing with them a rain of blood. The tiger didn't even have time to scream before it was dragged into the ground by the tentacles. At the same time, the sand at the bottom of the pit collapsed as if someone had placed a funnel below. The tigers couldn't figure out the situation for a moment and were all stunned. The ground was collapsing little by little. Not long after, a hole with black fog appeared in front of the tigers. This was simply a naked provocation. The huge white tiger let out a roar towards the sky. It suddenly rose into the air and flew to the top of the cave. An almost substantial shockwave was released from its mouth, causing ripples in the air. The shockwave blasted into the cave. A shrill scream came from the hole. A few tentacles that were still stained with blood shot out from the hole and pierced straight into the sky. The rest of the tigers opened their mouths without hesitation. Waves of sound waves bombarded the tentacles like dense raindrops. In just an instant, those tentacles were blown into minced meat. Continuous screams came from the hole, each louder than the last. The tigers nervously circled around the hole, not daring to let down their guard. A thing that looked like a flower bud the size of a human head suddenly flew out of the hole. Before the tigers could react, it exploded with a bang. Countless black liquid sputtered in all directions with the explosion. With such a dense attack, even if the tigers had wings that could soar in the sky, it was useless. There was no way to dodge at all. Every tiger's body was more or less splashed with some of the black liquid. Wherever the black liquid touched, wisps of black smoke would immediately come out from that place and make a sizzling sound. All the tigers roared in pain. The contaminated places were corroded in a short period of time to reveal eerie white bones. Then, immediately, the white bones were contaminated and turned black. Some of the tigers could no longer maintain their balance and fell diagonally to the ground. After a moment, there was no longer a soaring figure in the sky. All the tigers were rolling on the ground. The more serious ones were lying there weakly, dying. Amidst the continuous screams of the tigers, a strange-looking thing emerged from the hole. From the outside, it looked like a 7-colored datura flower that had been magnified many times. The petals were covered with small holes, and traces of faint black mist were constantly emitting from these holes. What was even more strange was that where the stamen should have been, there was a human face. It had complete facial features and was fleshy, looking extremely disgusting. A few tentacle-like things drooped in the mouth of the human face. From the broken parts, sticky liquid was still dripping out. At this time, a tiger was rolling on the ground because of the pain. It rolled near the hole. The tentacles in the mouth of the human face suddenly extended a lot and pierced into the tiger's body. The tiger's huge body suddenly shrank at a speed visible to the naked eye. At the same time, the black mist emitted from the holes on the petals became thicker. However, the other tigers did not notice this. When they were in extreme pain, who would care about something that had nothing to do with them? Such a scene appeared in front of Sunir's eyes. The valley was full of white tigers rolling on the ground. The wings that were originally used to soar in the sky were heavily bent on the ground, constantly letting out teeth-numbing sounds of bones breaking. However, the tigers did not seem to notice. At most, they were constantly letting out miserable cries, as if this was the only way to reduce their pain. Then, Sunir saw the monster. As if it was taking a leisurely stroll, it pulled out the tentacles in its mouth from the body of a tiger and pierced into the body of the next tiger. All the tigers that were attacked by it had shriveled up, as if all their energy had been sucked dry. This was not enough to constitute a reason for Sunir to take the initiative to attack. It was just that the monsters were killing each other. The tentacles in the monster's mouth stretched out to more than 10 meters long. Sunir also noticed that after every tiger was sucked dry, not only did the mist become thicker, even the tentacles became thicker. The distance that they stretched out was also further than the previous time. It was not the first time Sunir had heard of a monster that relied on devouring others to strengthen itself. It was obvious that the monster in front of her was using this method. Glancing at the valley, she saw that it was full of desolation. There was not a single complete 7-colored datura flower in sight. Sunir could not help but feel a trace of resentment in her heart. If she wanted to leave through the entrance, she had to have the datura flower. Otherwise, she might be trapped here forever. The resentment that had been accumulated for a long time exploded at this moment. Sunir did not even think about how terrifying an existence that could make so many white tigers on the verge of death was. Drawing the bow, knocking the arrow, and shooting furiously, this series of actions was completed in an instant. It could also be said that when Sunir found that there were no more complete datura flowers and that there was no possibility of her completing the trial, she was already prepared to shoot this arrow. The monster's reaction speed was not very fast. It only had time to raise its head when Sunir's arrow was about to pierce its body. With a poof, Sunir's arrow shot between the monster's eyes. After 3 days, Han Jean and Yelena finally walked out of the swamp area thousands of miles away and arrived at the Hamara Plain, which was famous for its richness. However, it was a little different from what Yelena had described. Han Jean could not see the beauty of the Hamara Plain, only the smoke rising from the 4 directions. Along the way, Han Jean encountered countless orc warrior squads. There were not many of them, and they were in groups of 3 or 5. Although they could not pose any threat to Han Jean and Yelena, if they were attacking ordinary people, a few orc warriors would be enough to completely destroy a small village. Han Jin believed that the orcs' tactic of breaking up into smaller groups would definitely cause great losses to the capital of elements, but Yelena did not think so. From her, Han Jin gained a deeper understanding of the capital of element. Before Grand Duke Solomon built the capital of elements, the Hamara Plain was the world of the orcs. In fact, Wild Willow City, the Biteman City, and other cities were originally part of the Orc Federation. However, after the elite orc warriors were all annihilated by the Holy Sea at the Mountain of the Unsetting Sun, their power declined day by day. Their territory gradually shrank, and the Hamara Plain became their last base. The orcs did not like to do production, nor did they like to do ordinary jobs such as forging, brewing, weaving, and so on. They thought that doing these jobs was a disgrace to their warriors' dignity, but they also had their own way, which was to amass wealth and population through plundering, then make the slaves work for them. During the period when the empire was unified, the orcs had to abide by certain rules. They rented out their land for people to farm. Although this was also a form of exploitation, there were laws and principles to follow. After the empire collapsed, the orcs were no longer willing to abide by the rules. It must be admitted that although there were wise orcs, the probability of them being born was pitifully small. Therefore, most of them were unwilling to control their greed. To give a simple example, if they let the humans farm the land, they would be able to harvest more than 200 pounds of wheat per moo. The orcs would only be able to get 20% of that, which was 40 pounds of wheat. The remaining 160 pounds of wheat would be given to the humans to buy seeds for the next year, change farming tools, feed their families, and so on. At that time, the lives of the humans were still quite good. However, the orcs were not satisfied. Why can I only get 20%? Can I get 80% and you guys get 20%? It's fine as long as you don't starve to death and can continue working. The orcs increased the rent step by step, which aroused the resistance of the farmer. However, the orcs were even angrier. They used force to turn all the farmer into their slaves, killing anyone who resisted. If they killed everyone, there would be no one left to farm. It was fine. They could go out and plunder at any time. At that time, the continent hadn't fallen into total chaos yet. Many wise people stood up and attacked the cruel behavior of the beastmen. Their unbridled plundering was a kind of robbery-like logic that broke the rules to obtain things. And any act of breaking the rules to obtain things would cause irreparable and destructive damage to society. However, the orcs did not care about this. They continued to do what they were supposed to do and lived a leisurely and happy life. However, as time passed, the orcs realized that their happy and prosperous lives were getting further and further away from them. They had already taken all the resources, but their lives were still not as good as before. With the orcs' intelligence, they could not understand why. The only thing they could do was to plunder even more crazily. Almost every orc had a large amount of gold and silver in their home, but their standard of living plummeted. All the merchants on the continent regarded the Hamara Plain as hell. No one was willing to do business with the orcs, because not only did the orcs lose their wealth, but even their lives were not guaranteed. Their own material production was decreasing day by day, and they could not replenish it from the outside world. It was not hard to imagine the orcs' lives. In the end, Solomon, the star of magic, raised his arm and gathered hundreds of thousands of human slaves around him, driving the orcs out of the Hamara Plain. Because they had lived together with the orcs for a long time and resisted their rule, the humans living in the Hamara Plain were brave and aggressive. Of course, the quality of the strong people here was far less than in isolated Cliff City, but the population was large. They were either loyal to Grand Duke Solomon or returned to their hometowns to protect their homes. Moreover, the people in the capital of elements lived a nomadic life. Every early spring, they would leave the town and rush to the countryside. At this time, Grand Duke Solomon would attack Fado City to contain the main forces of Forza. At the end of autumn, when the wheat fields were almost harvested, the farmer would gather in the town and take away everything that could be taken away, including farm tools, cattle, sheep, and so on. Grand Duke Solomon would also withdraw his army and give up the Hamara plain. The orcs could do whatever they wanted. Facts proved Yelena's words. Han Jin passed by several small villages, but there was nothing in them. It was like a dead village. Then, he passed by a heavily fortified town surrounded by a wall more than 10 meters high. Inside, he could even faintly see 2 master towers. In order to capture such a big town, the orcs could only send out their main forces. It was absolutely impossible to rely on those stragglers. Han Jin just wanted to get to the capital of elements as soon as possible. He had no interest in observing and learning, so he directly flew past the town. Another 3 days passed in the blink of an eye. When the travel-worn Han Jin and Yelena crossed a stone bridge, they finally saw a majestic city in front of them. Yelena let out a long sigh as if she was in a dream. She had finally returned home after more than a year of traveling. Although what she had seen and experienced in the past year was more colorful than what she had experienced in the past 10 years, home was always home. The feeling of home was irreplaceable. Han Jin slowed down the unicorn's speed. When they were about to reach the city gate, they met a patrol team. The patrol team didn't make any trouble, but only looked at the intimate young couple with curious eyes before passing by them. After entering the east gate of the capital of elements, a majestic momentum hit them in the face. The straight streets were much more spacious than those in the Holy Crown City, and they were also very clean. Han Jin paid attention to the complexion of the pedestrians on both sides. Most of them looked very good. It was useless to listen to other people's praises. He had to see and feel it himself. The complexion of the people living at the bottom was enough to prove the vitality of the city, whether they lived and worked in peace, and whether they were willing to accept the rule of Solomon. With so many people, Yelena naturally felt embarrassed to continue leaning in Han Jin's arms. She jumped off the unicorn, and Han Jin also jumped down. The two walked side by side on the street. In fact, at this moment, Yelena wished she could grow wings and fly back to the person who was so strict and unreasonable, but she missed him very much. However, she also wanted Han Jin to be more familiar with the city and recognize it, so she tried to control herself and slowed down. Han Jin had been observing both sides. When he heard Yelena say that the capital of elements had been expanded 4 times, he was shocked because he saw that the layout of the houses and streets on both sides was very reasonable. There was no trace of expansion, which proved that when Solomon dug the first shovel of soil here, he already had a complete idea in his mind. He didn't want to build a stronghold, but a large city. No matter how long the road was, it would eventually end. After walking for half a day, Yelena was already feeling tired. Another tall city wall appeared in front of them, even taller than the one outside. Under the city gate, there were more than 20 fully armed soldiers standing there like nails. Han Jin remembered that when they stepped into the capital of elements, no one came to check them. However, this place seemed to be heavily guarded, and there was no pedestrian in sight. "Here we are," Yelena whispered, and then turned to look at Han Jin. She looked at him very seriously, or rather it was a kind of gaze. "You're tuning into the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.